By the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, rapid shifts in global climate created environmental disruptions on a scale that human communities had never previously experienced. This section begins with the broad geological setting that shaped the earliest human experiences with catastrophic flooding. During the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, between roughly 11,700 and 8,000 BCE, Earth underwent significant climatic warming. This shift brought glacial retreat, rising sea levels, and large-scale hydrological changes across multiple continents. Records indicate that global sea levels rose more than 60 meters within several millennia, a pace that repeatedly inundated coastlines, river deltas, and low-lying settlements. Archaeologists and geologists view these events as critical background conditions for the emergence of widespread flood memory among early human populations. The earliest communities vulnerable to these changes were positioned along major river systems and littoral zones, where resources were abundant and predictable. These environments, however, were also among the most sensitive to climatic volatility. In regions such as the Black Sea Basin, the Persian Gulf, the North Sea Plains, and coastal Southeast Asia, evidence indicates that rising waters gradually submerged landscapes that had once supported human habitation. Stratigraphic surveys in these areas document rapid shoreline transgressions, the deposition of floodborne sediments, and the abandonment of early settlements. These geological markers provide an empirical baseline for understanding how early societies experienced dramatic environmental transformations. The archaeological record also reveals how early Holocene hydrology reshaped the world's most important river valleys. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates system expanded and contracted repeatedly as rainfall patterns shifted. Core samples from the southern Mesopotamian alluvium show layers of silt consistent with large-scale flooding, deposited during periods when ice melt increased the river's discharge. Similar patterns appear in the Nile Valley, where fluctuations in monsoon strength raised flood levels significantly during the African humid period. These data demonstrate that several of the world's earliest agricultural centers formed under conditions of unstable water systems, making large floods a recurring and deeply impactful element of early human experience. Interpretive insight emerges when examining how these environmental patterns shaped social responses. Early communities developed flexible subsistence strategies, seasonally mobile herding, flood recession farming, and elevated dwellings that indicate a persistent need to adapt to irregular water regimes. This suggests that the memory of destructive floods was embedded not only in environmental reality but also in the practical rhythms of daily life. The scale and frequency of these events gave them unusual cultural weight, eventually contributing to their transformation into foundational narratives within ancient tradition. Geological events of exceptional magnitude further reinforced these experiences. Around 8,200 BCE, a sudden global cooling event triggered major disruptions in precipitation and runoff patterns. Records from ice cores in Greenland, lake sediments in Europe, and river terraces in the Near East all indicate increased hydrological instability during this period. Some researchers propose that the breaking of glacial lakes in North America released vast quantities of freshwater into the North Atlantic, altering ocean circulation and indirectly intensifying regional flood cycles. While connections between these events and specific flood myths remain debated, the timing aligns with the broader rise of complex oral traditions in early postglacial societies. The Black Sea flooding hypothesis provides another important case study. Marine geologists have noted that during the early Holocene, the Black Sea existed as a freshwater lake positioned well below global sea level. As ocean levels rose, water from the Mediterranean is believed to have breached the Bosporus, potentially transforming the basin rapidly. Sediment cores taken from the seafloor reveal a sharp transition from freshwater to marine species, suggesting a sudden and substantial influx of seawater. Although the exact rate and impact of this event remain contested, its scale was sufficient to reshape regional geography. This kind of large environmental transformation provides a plausible material context for later Anatolian and Near Eastern flood traditions. Another relevant geological process is the periodic overflow and avulsion of major river systems. In South Asia, the Indus River repeatedly changed course throughout the Holocene, leaving abandoned channels that archaeologists have documented across the region. In China, paleoclimatic studies show that intensified monsoons between 5000 and 3000 BCE produced large floods along the Yellow River, contributing to the buildup of silt layers characteristic of catastrophic inundations. These events demonstrate that destructive flooding was not a localized phenomenon. It was a global pattern experienced by early agrarian societies across multiple continents. A second interpretive insight arises from the scale and repetition of these events. Floods were among the few environmental phenomena capable of erasing entire landscapes, altering coastlines, and displacing entire populations within a single generation. This distinguishes them from other natural hazards such as droughts or storms, which rarely produced such widespread geographical change. Because floods had the capacity to reshape both environment and community simultaneously, they held a unique position in collective memory, becoming central to the cosmologies of early cultures. The archaeological record preserves evidence of how these disruptions influenced settlement patterns. In Mesopotamia, early Ubaid sites show signs of repeated rebuilding on elevated mounds, suggesting adaptation to recurring inundation. In the Persian Gulf region, submerged paleo-shorelines indicate that communities migrated inland as waters advanced. Along the Yellow River, Neolithic settlements were constructed increasingly farther from the riverbanks over time, reflecting long-term attempts to mitigate risk. These movements demonstrate a clear cause-effect relationship between environmental instability and the evolution of early social organization. Textual evidence from later periods preserves memories of these conditions in mythological form. While Chapter 1 focuses primarily on geological context, it is important to note that the earliest written references to great floods, whether in Mesopotamia, India, China, or the Mediterranean, consistently situate these events in a deep past marked by environmental upheaval. Though not direct historical records, these texts reflect long-standing oral traditions shaped by real ecological experiences. Their consistency across cultures underscores how universally catastrophic floods were to early human societies. A final interpretive insight concerns the interaction between climate change and cultural development. The early Holocene was not only a period of environmental disruption, it also coincided with the emergence of agriculture, permanent settlements, and increasingly complex social systems. As populations expanded and communities became less mobile, the impact of large floods intensified. The growth of irrigation agriculture further increased reliance on predictable water sources. Thus, the environmental pressures of the early Holocene intersected with human transitions toward sedentism, making flood events more socially disruptive and more culturally significant. By the end of this period, the combination of rising seas, shifting rivers, and climatic instability had produced a world in which floods were both common and consequential. These conditions form the environmental foundation upon which later flood narratives would develop. The next section examines how early human communities recorded, transmitted, and codified these experiences into structured oral traditions that would later appear in written form. As environmental volatility shaped early settlements, the memory of large-scale inundations began moving from lived experience into collective narrative, forming the earliest proto-mythic traditions of the ancient world. As rivers stabilized, they became both lifelines and threats. By the early Holocene, between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, human communities began shifting from highly mobile foraging groups to increasingly sedentary settlement clusters anchored to river systems. Archaeological surveys across Africa, Southwest Asia, South Asia, and East Asia indicate that this transition was neither uniform nor simultaneous, yet it consistently formed around the same environmental dynamic, the stabilizing hydrology of major rivers. As glacial meltwaters receded and global temperatures rose, floodplains expanded, soil fertility increased, and freshwater reliability improved. These conditions made river valleys among the few regions where long-term settlement could be sustained with predictable resources. Records indicate that early Holocene river stabilization coincided with the first permanent structures in many regions, suggesting a direct causal link between water reliability and emergent sedentism. Evidence from early Nile Valley sites such as Wadi Kabaniya and later Merimd Beni Salama shows successive layers of habitation built atop alluvial sequences. Archaeologists uncovered repeated cycles of settlement, flood destruction, and reconstruction, demonstrating that communities were already adapting to hydrological variability millennia before large-scale agriculture developed. Similar findings at early Euphrates, Tigris sites, including Abu Huraira and Muribet, reveal long-term occupations centered around seasonal flooding that replenished nearby soils. In these regions, rising water tables during periodic floods appear to have allowed the cultivation of wild cereals, creating conditions that encouraged semi-permanent dwelling structures. The archaeological pattern suggests a feedback loop. Water predictability encouraged settlement, and settlement encouraged intensified reliance on flood-dependent landscapes. In South Asia, excavations at early Indus-related sites such as Mehrgarh indicate a comparable pattern. Sediment cores taken from surrounding floodplains show alternating layers of silt and sand, marking episodes of strong seasonal flooding. According to geological analyses, these layers match broader Holocene monsoon cycles, implying that settlement continuity depended on communities developing strategies to work within shifting hydrological regimes. Evidence of early irrigation attempts, small channels carved into the landscape, illustrates that by the 7th millennium BCE, some groups were actively modifying water flow rather than simply adapting to it. This represents one of the earliest known human efforts to engineer environmental stability, demonstrating how water dependency shaped early technological experimentation. A similar dynamic appears in East Asia along the Yellow River basin. Early dwellings at sites such as Palagang and Sishan show consistent patterns of settlement near tributaries prone to sudden flooding. Geological surveys of the Yellow River's middle course reveal repeated deposition of fine loess sediments, creating both fertile soils and unstable floodplain environments. Archaeologists uncovered multiple occupation layers separated by flood-induced abandonment phases, suggesting that early communities frequently relocated to nearby elevated areas. This pattern of riverbank migration indicates active attempts to stay within optimal ecological zones while mitigating flood risk. The historical significance lies in demonstrating a dual dependency. Communities relied on the river's rich soils yet remained vulnerable to its volatile behavior. Across these regions, hydrological dependence manifested in two structural ways. First, communities oriented their subsistence strategies around flood pulses, timing foraging, planting, and harvesting around seasonal water flows. Second, settlement permanence increased as floodplain resources allowed year-round habitation. However, the archaeological record shows that this permanence remained precarious. Alluvial deposits in the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, the Indus Basin, and the Yellow River Plain each preserve evidence of destructive flood events, often burying occupation layers beneath thick sediments. These strata provide direct insight into how environmental instability shaped human decision-making. The repeated rebuilding of settlements on or near flood-damaged zones suggests that communities considered the benefits of floodplain life to outweigh the risks. Interpretive insights emerge from comparing the archaeological sequences across continents. One observation is that early societies tolerated high degrees of environmental uncertainty so long as resource abundance remained predictable. This implies that risk assessment was already a significant element of early human settlement planning. Another insight is that the clustering of populations near rivers facilitated the eventual development of permanent agricultural fields. Flood-driven soil renewal effectively reduced the labor required for early cultivation, thereby encouraging experimentation with plant domestication. A third insight is that these riverine environments served as natural corridors for mobility and interaction, contributing to early cultural diffusion across settlement networks. Floodplain sediment cores further illuminate the long-term environmental pressures shaping early human landscapes. At the Tigris-Euphrates confluence, for example, deep cores show layers of fine clay indicative of large-scale inundations that reshaped river courses over time. Such evidence reveals that rivers were not static boundaries but dynamic systems that demanded continual adjustment. In the Indus region, pollen and phytolith samples found within sediment layers indicate shifts between wetter and drier phases, showing how monsoon variability directly affected settlement viability. These findings demonstrate that human communities were embedded within ecological cycles that operated beyond their control, forcing them to repeatedly adapt strategies for survival. As permanent settlements grew, water dependency intensified. Storage pits, early granaries, and post-hole structures show increasing investment in fixed locations. With these investments came rising vulnerability. A severe flood could undermine food stores, collapse dwellings, and render fields temporarily unusable. This vulnerability created long-term pressures for more deliberate water management. Archaeological evidence of small channels, levees, and diversion ditches across several early Holocene sites suggests that communal labor was already being mobilized to regulate water, laying groundwork for the more complex hydraulic systems that would later define early civilizations. By the end of the 7th millennium BCE, the relationship between rivers and settlements had become mutually reinforcing. Rivers provided sustenance and fertile terrain, while human groups created increasingly permanent communities that depended on predictable hydrological rhythms. Yet sediment layers and shifting habitation zones indicate that this relationship remained fragile. The dual pressures of resource abundance and environmental instability shaped early human societies long before written records appeared. Along these rivers, the earliest recorded flood memories would take shape. The sea did not simply rise, it swallowed worlds. Around 11,500 to 11,000 years ago, Earth experienced one of the most abrupt sea level increases of the late Pleistocene, early Holocene transition, known as meltwater pulse 1b. Geological records indicate that global sea levels rose approximately 7 to 9 meters within a relatively short interval, likely a few centuries. This change was driven by rapid disintegration of northern hemisphere ice sheets at the end of the Younger Dryas. For coastal communities occupying low-lying plains, deltas, and river mouths, this transformation altered entire landscapes. Modern bathymetric surveys demonstrate that many continental shelves now lying beneath shallow seas were once habitable terrain. The archaeological implication is clear. Vast stretches of human-occupied coastline were inundated within living memory, creating conditions where generational accounts of rising waters could be preserved. The Persian Gulf Basin presents one of the most illustrative examples of this transformation. During the late Pleistocene, the Gulf floor was a dry river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin systems. According to marine sediment cores, this valley supported freshwater marshes and fertile floodplains, making it an optimal environment for early human groups. As sea levels rose during meltwater pulse 1b, salt water from the Indian Ocean progressively flooded the basin. Geological surveys identify a clear sequence: riverine sediments at lower levels, estuarine layers above them, and finally fully marine deposits. This vertical stratigraphy confirms that the Gulf transitioned from a terrestrial corridor to a marine environment in a geologically brief period. For populations inhabiting this region, the loss of arable land would have required migration toward higher ground, creating demographic pressures that likely influenced settlement patterns across southern Mesopotamia. A similar process occurred in Doggerland, the landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Core samples extracted from the North Sea reveal buried soils, peat layers, and remnants of ancient forests, evidence of a landscape that supported Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations. Archaeologists uncovered preserved tree stumps and worked flint tools along submerged banks, indicating sustained human activity before inundation. As sea levels rose during meltwater pulse 1b, large portions of Doggerland transformed into marshland and shallow estuaries before eventually submerging entirely. The gradual reduction in habitable land would have forced communities to move repeatedly as coastlines retreated. This pattern of displacement aligns with broader evidence of demographic shifts in northern Europe around the same period. The environmental pressures created by rising waters not only reshaped geography, but may have reinforced communal memory of a land lost to the sea. Coastal transformations were equally dramatic in Southeast Asia, where shallow continental shelves meant that even moderate sea level increases produced large territorial losses. Regions now forming the Gulf of Thailand, the Java Sea, and parts of the South China Sea were once broad lowland plains supporting rivers, forests, and migration routes. Marine transgression layers in these areas show clear evidence of rapid shoreline retreat. According to geological analyses, rising sea levels flooded major river deltas, including the ancient courses of the Chao Phraya and Mekong. Submerged valleys and relic coastlines mapped through sonar imaging point to significant human activity before inundation. The scale of the transformation was extensive. Many coastal communities would have witnessed not only rising waters but fundamental changes in ecosystems as freshwater zones transitioned into coastal estuaries and ultimately into open sea. For populations dependent on coastal foraging, these shifts required substantial adjustments to subsistence strategies. One interpretive insight emerges from comparing these three regions. Although the rate of sea level rise was globally consistent, the local effects varied dramatically, shaping distinct cultural responses. In narrow basins like the Persian Gulf, rising waters rapidly filled a confined region, producing a recognizable and irreversible loss of land. In contrast, in broader plains such as Southeast Asia, communities experienced repeated shoreline retractions over generations, which may have contributed to long-term cultural narratives about advancing seas. In Northern Europe, slow but persistent flooding of Doggerland altered regional mobility and interconnectedness, influencing patterns of cultural exchange. Another insight concerns the depth of oral tradition. If communities witnessed landscape loss across multiple generations, memory of drowning valleys, disappearing forests, and shifting coastlines could plausibly persist in cultural narratives long after the events themselves. While caution is necessary in linking geological events to later myths, the scale of Meltwater Pulse 1b provides a credible environmental backdrop for stories describing lands swallowed by the sea. Many ancient narratives documented in later millennia, including in Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, and South Asia, emphasize sudden inundations and irreversible territorial loss. Although these accounts cannot be directly mapped onto specific Holocene events, the archaeological record suggests that the human experience of rising waters was widespread enough to support long-term cultural memory. A further analytical observation is that forced migration triggered by rising seas likely increased interaction among inland and coastal populations. In the Persian Gulf region, for instance, retreating communities would have moved northward into areas that later became centers of Neolithic development. The demographic pressures created by shrinking coastlines may have contributed to the clustering of early agricultural settlements in river valleys. This interpretation aligns with broader paleoenvironmental studies showing post-glacial population reorganizations across Eurasia. Geological evidence continues to refine understanding of Meltwater Pulse 1b. Marine cores taken from continental shelves consistently show transgression sequences. Basal terrestrial sediments overlain by brackish deposits, then by marine sands and silts. Drowned river valleys, sometimes preserved in remarkable detail, demonstrate the suddenness of these transitions. In the North Sea, for example, deep seismic imaging reveals the paleochannels of ancient rivers, now submerged but preserving their original contours. In Southeast Asia, sonar mapping shows former coastlines extending hundreds of kilometers seaward of present-day shores. These features collectively confirm that large parts of the world's coasts experienced transformative inundation within a relatively compressed time frame. By the close of Meltwater Pulse 1b, global coastlines had reached configurations broadly similar to today's. Yet for the populations who lived through the transition, the memory of displaced settlements and altered landscapes would have persisted long after the waters stabilized. Archaeological evidence of shifting habitation zones, combined with geological data on rapid marine incursions, indicates that early Holocene societies experienced environmental changes of a scale sufficient to generate long-term cultural recollection. By the time writing emerged, these memories had already passed through thousands of years of oral transmission. In southern Mesopotamia, water was the architect of both cities and disasters. Southern Mesopotamia developed within one of the most dynamic river systems of the ancient world. The Tigris and Euphrates, fed by rainfall and snowmelt from the Armenian and Anatolian highlands, carried seasonal surges of water and sediment into the flat alluvial plain that stretched toward the Persian Gulf. Unlike the relatively predictable Nile, the Mesopotamian rivers exhibited irregular timing, variable discharge, and rapid fluctuations in volume. Hydrological reconstructions indicate that the region's early Holocene climate encouraged episodes of sudden flooding followed by prolonged low water periods. Archaeologists studying the ancient levee systems note that the natural embankments along these rivers shifted frequently, forcing early communities to adapt to unstable channels. This volatility shaped both the environmental opportunities and the constraints faced by the earliest city builders. The alluvium deposited by the rivers produced highly fertile soils. These deep silt layers created conditions favorable for intensive agriculture, especially barley cultivation. By the 4th millennium BCE, irrigation networks expanded across the southern plain, allowing settlements to grow beyond subsistence capacity. Canals redistributed river water into fields, while drainage ditches managed salinity and floodwater retention. However, this system was only sustainable when river behavior remained within manageable limits. When floods arrived earlier or stronger than expected, they destroyed fields, washed away canal banks, and disrupted the carefully balanced agricultural regime. According to sediment analyses conducted near the ancient city of Uruk, some flood layers show rapid deposition consistent with sudden overflow events. These findings highlight the dual nature of the rivers. They provided the fertility that supported urban expansion, but also posed a perennial threat to economic stability. Sites across the region preserve physical evidence of these disruptions. At Shurapak, excavations revealed a distinct layer of river-deposited silt dating to approximately 2900 to 2800 BCE. The stratum lies between early dynastic occupation levels and contains freshwater mollusk shells, water-rounded debris, and fine clay consistent with a substantial flood event. The archaeologists who documented this layer noted its uniformity across multiple excavation areas, suggesting that the inundation was extensive enough to impact the entire settlement. Although the layer does not indicate a civilization-ending flood, it provides empirical evidence that large-scale destructive floods were part of the region's environmental experience. Similarly, at Kish, stratigraphy shows episodes of abrupt sediment deposition associated with river overflow in the early 3rd millennium BCE. These deposits are interspersed with layers containing domestic debris, indicating that flooding temporarily displaced habitation but did not permanently interrupt urban continuity. Excavations at Ur reveal comparable patterns. Below the monumental complexes of the later city, archaeologists identified a layer of water-laid clay roughly 1 meter thick, which lies atop Ubaid and late Uruk remains. This layer corresponds to a significant inundation event, though the exact extent and severity remain debated. Radiocarbon samples from these flood layers collectively place them within the early dynastic period, roughly aligning with the chronological horizon referenced in later Mesopotamian texts that describe an ancient flood preceding the reign of early kings. These stratified flood deposits demonstrate more than isolated disasters. They illustrate how environmental instability intersected with emerging political complexity. When the early city-states of southern Mesopotamia began forming around 3200 to 3000 BCE, their prosperity depended heavily on controlling river water. Irrigation was not merely agricultural infrastructure, it was a political tool. Managing canals, maintaining levees, and organizing labor for water distribution required hierarchical authority. The variability of the rivers therefore reinforced the need for administrative oversight. As records from later periods indicate, canal cleaning duties, flood response measures, and storage planning fell under centralized supervision. Even early on, environmental unpredictability would have strengthened the rationale for leadership capable of coordinating large-scale responses. An interpretive insight emerges from the connection between hydrology and social memory. In a region where floods could erase fields, displace communities, and reshape river courses, the experience of inundation became part of the cultural baseline. These events did not occur every year, but when they did, their impact was significant enough to leave both archaeological and psychological traces. Over generations, such experiences may have contributed to collective narratives emphasizing the destructive potential of water. This does not explain later literary motifs directly, but it establishes a credible environmental foundation for why flood stories held particular resonance in Mesopotamia. A second observation relates to the geographical constraints of the southern alluvial plain. The land's low gradient meant that floodwaters spread horizontally over wide areas rather than carving deep channels. This created shallow but extensive inundations capable of disrupting entire urban clusters. Since settlements such as Shuruppak, Uar, and Kish were positioned close to the riverbanks to access water for irrigation and trade, they remained vulnerable to overflow events. Archaeological surveys show repeated settlement relocations or rebuildings slightly north or west of earlier sites, likely responses to shifting river courses. These movements reinforce the idea that environmental volatility influenced settlement planning and long-term urban development. Textual references from the early 2nd millennium BCE, notably in administrative tablets from cities like Lagash and Larsa, describe canal breaches, levee failures, and emergency grain allocations following unexpected floods. While these documents come from a later period, they reflect a long-standing pattern. Water management failures carried both economic and political consequences. If canal systems were damaged, agricultural productivity declined, creating shortages that rulers were expected to remedy. This reinforces the argument that environmental challenges shaped governance structures well before the emergence of formal written narratives about primeval floods. The archaeological record also shows that communities responded to these challenges through increasingly sophisticated hydraulic engineering. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, city-states built extensive canal networks, diversion channels, and reinforced levees. These projects required coordination across multiple settlements, suggesting a growing recognition that flood management was a regional issue rather than a purely local one. The scale of these efforts indicates not only technological capability but a clear understanding of the river's destructive potential. By combining environmental data, flood stratigraphy, and early administrative practices, scholars can better understand why the Tigris-Euphrates system produced some of the earliest written reflections on catastrophic inundation. Floods were not abstract events but recurrent phenomena that shaped daily life, political authority, and urban survival. They created conditions in which narratives about overwhelming waters could gain lasting cultural significance. These conditions framed the world that produced the earliest flood narratives. The earliest known flood survivor was not Noah, but Ziusudra, a king of Sumer. The earliest flood narrative preserved in written form appears not in later biblical or classical sources, but in a Sumerian composition often referred to as the Eridu Genesis. The surviving tablet, dated on paleographic grounds to approximately 2150 to 2000 BCE, was recovered from the ancient city of Nippur. Although the text is fragmentary, its narrative structure is sufficiently preserved to reconstruct the essential elements of a primeval flood story already well established in the late 3rd millennium BCE. The tablet presents a world supervised by a divine assembly, outlines the appointment of an antediluvian king named Ziusudra, and describes a divinely initiated flood intended to terminate human life. This composition represents the earliest textual articulation of a tradition that would resonate across multiple cultures for millennia. In the Eridu Genesis, human society is organized under the guidance of the gods, who decree that cities should be established and kingship instituted. The text names 5 cities that existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, mirroring the sequence preserved in the Sumerian king list. This correlation suggests that the composer drew from a broader cultural understanding of a structured pre-flood world governed by divinely sanctioned authority. The presence of a formal kingship system prior to the flood indicates that the narrator envisioned a civilized landscape rather than a primordial wilderness. This point is significant because it reflects a cultural memory in which urbanization and political hierarchy precede the cataclysm, rather than emerging afterward. Ziusudra, the central human figure in the myth, appears in the narrative as a king and a priest, responsible for maintaining ritual observances. His dual role highlights the integrated nature of political and religious authority in Sumerian society. According to the text, the gods convene and decide that humanity must be destroyed by a flood. Although the reason for this decision is damaged in the surviving tablet, later Akkadian parallels attribute divine dissatisfaction with human noise or behavior. The Sumerian version implies a similar rationale, though scholars caution that the tablet's missing lines limit firm conclusions. What is clear is that the decision was collective, reached by a divine council that included major deities responsible for appointing kingship and regulating cosmic order. One deity, however, chooses to preserve life. The text names a god, likely Enki, based on thematic parallels, who provides Ziusudra with instructions to build a large vessel. The specifics of the vessel's construction are not preserved, but the narrative emphasis rests on the act of divine disclosure. The decision to save a single king reflects an interpretive insight. The Sumerian tradition frames the flood not as a universal reset, but as a selective preservation of rulership and ritual knowledge. By escaping the flood, Ziusudra carries forward the legitimacy of kingship, linking pre-flood and post-flood eras. This continuity is central, as later scribes integrated the flood into their chronological frameworks to explain shifts in political memory. Archaeological correlations reinforce the text's cultural grounding. The 5 cities listed as antediluvian centers are all known from excavation to have significant occupation levels in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Shuruppak, in particular, has produced a notable flood stratum around 2900 to 2800 BCE, containing silt deposits and waterborne materials. While scholars caution that this layer cannot be directly equated with the mythic flood, its existence demonstrates that destructive inundations occurred within the region's historical experience. Such events likely contributed to the shaping of a narrative in which a major flood stood as a chronological demarcation point between earlier traditions and later political order. The Eridu Genesis also preserves an important theological framework. The divine decision to create cities and establish kingship is followed by the decision to revoke that stability through a flood. This sequence suggests that concepts of divine favor and withdrawal were integral to Sumerian interpretations of social order. In this context, the flood becomes more than an environmental event. It is a symbolic explanation for discontinuity in the historical record. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later, makes this interpretive mechanism explicit. It states, "Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish." This line functions as a chronological dividing marker, indicating that the flood served as the boundary between early mythic kings and later historically grounded rulers. The use of the flood as a chronological rupture is one of the clearest examples of how early Mesopotamian scribes structured their understanding of time. The list's compilers inserted the flood not to recount an environmental disaster, but to explain changes in political geography. By assigning antediluvian rains to cities in the southern alluvial plain and post-flood rains to northern cities such as Kish, the scribes constructed a narrative that justified shifting centers of power. This interpretive insight highlights the flood's role as a historiographic device. It allowed later writers to reconcile archaeological discontinuities, political transformations, and cultural memory within a single explanatory framework. Ziusudra's fate after the flood further reinforces this structure. The Eridu Genesis describes him offering sacrifices to the gods after the waters subside. The divine assembly responds by granting him life in Dilmun, a distant and pure land often associated with longevity. This ending elevates Ziusudra from a historical figure to a culture hero whose survival ensures the continuation of ritual practice and moral authority. Although later traditions transformed this figure, appearing as Utnapishtim in Akkadian literature and with parallels to Noah in the Hebrew Bible, the Sumerian portrayal is the earliest attested. It emphasizes divine communication, ritual continuity, and the preservation of kingship as the essential elements of survival. The narrative's chronological placement is important. The earliest surviving copy of the Eridu Genesis dates to the late 3rd millennium BCE, but the story itself may be considerably older. Linguistic features and thematic parallels suggest that the flood narrative circulated in oral and written forms earlier in the 3rd millennium. The integration of antediluvian cities in both the myth and the Sumerian king list indicates that the flood tradition was already well embedded by the time of the earliest dynasties. This section's evidence underscores a key point. The Sumerian flood myth was not an isolated literary creation but part of a broader system of historical reasoning. It explained the transition between eras, legitimized new centers of power, and preserved the authority of kingship across temporal boundaries. The figure of Ziusudra embodies this continuity, standing at the hinge point between mythic antiquity and recorded political history. Akkadian scribes would soon adapt this story into a new epic tradition. With each retelling, the flood was refined to match new political and theological needs. In the centuries after the Sumerian account of Ziusudra, Mesopotamian scribes began reshaping the story to suit shifting religious structures, expanding populations, and new royal priorities. The result was not a single narrative, but a lineage of evolving texts, each version a mirror of the society that produced it. The earliest and most influential reworking appeared in the Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE. Unlike the Sumerian tale, which focused primarily on divine decision-making and the survival of a righteous king, Atrahasis situates the flood within a broader cosmic problem: the burdensome noise of humanity. According to the story, humans had become so numerous and so loud that they disturbed the senior god Enlil, who sought to curb the chaos. At first, the gods attempted lesser calamities, droughts, disease, famine, but humanity persisted. Only then did Enlil decide upon a flood, a final, total reset. What makes Atrahasis so significant is the introduction of a structured logic of cause and effect. Human population pressure, not merely divine whim, is cast as a destabilizing force. This reflects a real-world transformation occurring in Mesopotamia during the early 2nd millennium BCE, when cities grew more crowded and centralized than ever before. Urban density created new anxieties around resource allocation, labor control, and environmental strain. The flood thus becomes a theological solution to a recognizable societal challenge, a kind of mythologized population management. At the center of the story stands Atrahasis himself, a wise man favored by the god Enki, Ea in Akkadian. Enki secretly warns him of the coming catastrophe, instructing him to dismantle his house and convert it into a boat. Atrahasis preserves life by gathering seed, animals, and his household aboard the vessel. After the waters recede, he offers a sacrifice that attracts the starving gods, who had not anticipated the loss of human labor and offerings. The myth ends with divine reforms, new reproductive limits, mortality, and priestly celibacy, mechanisms meant to avert another catastrophic spike in human population. This emphasis on systemic balance marks a major thematic shift from earlier Sumerian traditions, revealing a more bureaucratic and administrative world where order had to be maintained through regulation rather than charisma or divine favor alone. Over the next centuries, scribes continued to refine and reinterpret the flood narrative, culminating in its most famous literary incarnation, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Compiled in its standard Babylonian form between roughly 1200 and 1000 BCE, the epic integrates the Atrahasis flood account into a much larger meditation on mortality, kingship, and the limits of human striving. The flood episode is recast as a story within a story, told by the immortal survivor Utnapishtim, the Akkadian counterpart of Atrahasis, to the grieving king Gilgamesh. This framing radically transforms the meaning of the flood. Instead of a lesson about population control or divine mismanagement, it becomes a philosophical parable. Gilgamesh, devastated by the death of his friend Enkidu, seeks the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim recounts the flood not to inspire hope, but to demonstrate the uniqueness of his own immortality and the impossibility of achieving it again. In this version, the flood is less about humanity's failure and more about the inscrutability of divine decisions. Its presence in the epic serves as a boundary marker. Some cosmic events occur only once, and their consequences cannot be undone. The Gilgamesh retelling also alters the emotional tone of the story, where Atrahasis emphasizes tension among the gods and the pragmatic need for population control. Gilgamesh leans into grief, awe, and resignation. Utnapishtim's recollection is nearly mournful, describing the gods' panic as the storm raged and the boat rose, like a raft upon the river. The intimate, almost confessional voice gives the flood a new literary depth, transforming it from a historical memory into a universal human reflection on survival and loss. These shifts track closely with broader political changes in Mesopotamia. By the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE, empires had grown larger and more centralized. Kingship ideology focused increasingly on divinely sanctioned order and stability. Incorporating the flood into an epic of heroic kingship allowed Babylonian scribes to connect their rulers to ancient cosmic events, reinforcing legitimacy through association with deep time. The story's theological nuances also reflect evolving conceptions of the gods, no longer merely powerful beings but architects of moral and existential boundaries. Across these retellings, one constant remains: the belief that the flood was a pivotal rupture in human history. Yet the meaning of that rupture transformed again and again. In the Sumerian world, it affirmed the survival of a chosen king. In the Old Babylonian era, it became a commentary on population dynamics and divine administration. In the Age of Gilgamesh, it served as a meditation on mortality itself. Through each iteration, the flood was molded to serve the needs of new audiences, a flexible memory, reshaped by shifting landscapes of power, theology, and human concern. The Mesopotamian story would travel farther than its scribes ever imagined. In Egypt, the flood was not feared, it was expected. Along the banks of the Nile, water did not arrive with chaos or surprise, but with a dependable rhythm that shaped every aspect of life. Unlike the violent and unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile's annual inundation unfolded with a steadiness that bordered on the sacred. Each year, between June and September, the river rose as meltwater and monsoon rains funneled northward from the Ethiopian highlands. The swelling brought dark silt, renewed soil fertility, and sustained the agricultural wealth that made Egypt one of the most stable civilizations of the ancient world. This predictability is the key to understanding why Egypt, despite being a riverine society dependent on annual flooding, never developed a central catastrophic flood myth. In Mesopotamia, divine wrath and natural disaster intertwined because floods genuinely threatened survival. But in Egypt, inundation was synonymous with order, balance, and the cyclical harmony of nature. Instead of destruction, the rise of the Nile was woven into the cosmic structure known as Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and correct functioning of the world. The river's behavior reinforced the notion that Egypt occupied a uniquely ordered universe, one in which the gods had established a benevolent, dependable cycle. Nevertheless, Egypt was not immune to hydrological extremes. On rare occasions, the inundation deviated from expectations. A too low flood could trigger famine, while a too high flood could damage settlements, irrigation works, and storage facilities. The first intermediate period, for example, contains literary laments that may reflect periods of drought and low Nile levels. Conversely, high floods sometimes swept away villages or clogged canals with silt. But even these events were framed not as cosmic disasters on the scale of a Mesopotamian deluge, but as failures in the smooth continuity of Ma'at. When the river misbehaved, the explanation was often political or moral. A weak king, social disorder, or improper ritual conduct could disrupt the divine harmony that sustained the land. Egyptian texts reflect this worldview. Instead of stories of world-ending floods, they preserve hymns praising the Nile's essential generosity. The New Kingdom Hymn to the Nile describes the river as a life-giver whose annual return ensures the prosperity of the fields and the contentment of the people. The tone is devotional rather than fearful, gratitude rather than anxiety. Scholars sometimes point to the famine stela, a later Ptolemaic inscription attributed to the reign of Djoser, which tells of a prolonged low inundation and the king's efforts to restore divine favor. But even here, the crisis is resolved through ritual and royal piety, not through an apocalyptic civilization cleansing event. Geography plays a decisive role in this distinction. The Nile flows along an exceptionally narrow, controlled corridor, hemmed in by deserts and lacking the extensive alluvial plains that give other rivers room to shift unpredictably. Its annual flood was also moderated by upstream basins that absorbed and released water gradually. This natural regulation contrasted sharply with the violent, sediment-choked surges of the Tigris and Euphrates. As a result, Egyptians could build agricultural systems, towns, and religious calendars around the expectation of a stable hydrological cycle. Their worldview mirrored that physical stability, reinforcing a cultural assumption that the universe, like the river, operated according to orderly cyclical patterns. Even so, the economic consequences of bad flood years were severe. A low inundation shrank arable land, reduced grain yields, and strained state-based redistribution systems. In high flood years, reconstruction and re-excavation of canals required significant labor and resources. Such events could test the authority of pharaohs, whose legitimacy was intimately tied to maintaining cosmic order. Yet these crises did not produce dramatic deluge myths because the Egyptian imagination leaned toward continuity, not rupture. Catastrophe was conceptualized as imbalance, a disruption requiring restoration, rather than as a divine attempt to erase and rebuild humanity. In this way, Egypt stands as a counterpoint in the ancient flood landscape, one of the world's greatest river civilizations, yet one without a flood-ending world myth. Its religious texts emphasize rebirth, cyclical renewal, and the reliable return of life. The Nile was not a threat to be survived. It was a partner in sustaining civilization. Yet elsewhere in Anatolia, floods took on a different symbolic meaning. In Anatolia, storms replaced oceans, but destruction remained the same. Within the religious and literary traditions of the Hittite and Hurrian cultures, water rarely appeared as the instrument of a world-ending catastrophe in the Mesopotamian sense. Yet the region preserved scattered motifs that echoed the structure and function of flood imagery. The Hittite heartland, centered on the central Anatolian plateau, experienced a different hydrological reality. Less governed by major rivers and more by seasonal rains, sudden downpours, and destructive storms associated with the powerful local storm god traditions. As a result, when destruction appeared in myth, it often came not from rising waters but from the sky, a fusion of meteorological volatility and divine intervention. The most relevant material appears not in a unified flood narrative but in fragments spread across the Hittite mythological corpus. The Kamarbi cycle, a Hurrian set of literary texts preserved in Hittite archives, contains episodes in which the storm god Tezhub engages in cosmic battles whose environmental imagery parallels elements of flood destruction. Although these episodes do not describe a deluge that wipes out humankind, they do depict the storm god unleashing overwhelming natural force. Scholars note that Teshub's demonstrations of power, thunder, rain, and the overturning of mountains reflect Anatolia's own extreme weather events. Unlike the predictable Nile or the alluvial floods of Mesopotamia, Anatolia's rainfall patterns were irregular and sometimes catastrophic. Myths therefore framed storms as divine tools of disorder, emphasizing suddenness and force rather than the long-rise inundation typical of river-based narratives. Hittite ritual texts also reveal a cultural memory of destructive water-related events. Some sequences describe the need to appease storm deities during periods of agricultural failure linked to heavy rains, drought cycles, or insufficient runoff. While none of these accounts point to a singular civilization-resetting flood, they nevertheless encode the recognition that excess water, delivered through storms rather than rivers, posed a significant threat. Archaeological layers at central Anatolian sites such as Hattusa show evidence of erosion damage and structural collapse likely tied to intense rainfall episodes. The mythological emphasis on storm gods as regulators of both fertility and destruction aligns with these environmental realities. A few myths come closer to flood-like imagery. In the tale of the disappearing god Telepainu, the world descends into disorder when the deity leaves his domain. Crops fail, animals cease reproducing, and the natural order collapses. Although the crisis is not depicted as a flood, the language of environmental breakdown mirrors the systemic devastation represented by deluge myths elsewhere in the Near East. The absence of a flood does not signal stability. Instead, chaos emerges through ecological imbalance rather than a singular watery catastrophe. This reflects an important interpretive insight. Anatolian mythological systems tended to view disaster as the cessation of vital processes, not the overwhelming of the world by water. Another set of narratives link destruction to the anger of the storm god through torrents of rain and thunder, sometimes described as the washing away of fields or settlements. These expressions likely reflect lived experiences in mountainous Anatolia, where flash floods in valleys and basins could be sudden and severe. Geological studies in the region identify sediment layers indicative of powerful short-term flooding events, including debris flows and valley inundations associated with intense precipitation. Such events would have reinforced cultural associations between storms and destructive hydrological forces, even if the broader cosmos was never imagined as being swept away. The absence of a canonical flood myth in Hittite tradition therefore stems from environmental and cultural structures rather than narrative deficiency. The region's ecology did not encourage the development of river-centered deluge stories, but it did promote a worldview in which storms held both generative and destructive potential. This duality explains why storm gods occupy such prominent roles in both Hittite and Hurrian pantheons, acting as mediators between atmospheric order and chaos. Their myths frequently describe conflict, disruption, and restoration, systemic processes that mirror the instability of Anatolian weather rather than a singular catastrophic event. Texts from the late Hittite period also show increasing influence from Mesopotamian mythology, including copies of narratives involving Atrahasis and other flood-related themes. However, even these imported elements did not fully displace local cosmological frameworks. When Mesopotamian motifs entered Hittite scribal culture, they were often adapted to fit existing storm god traditions, resulting in hybrid narratives where themes of destruction blended with meteorological imagery. This selective integration underscores Anatolia's distinct mythological character, receptive to external ideas but always filtered through regional environmental experience. Taken together, these sources reveal that while Anatolia never produced a deluge myth in the Mesopotamian or biblical sense, it preserved a parallel logic of destruction grounded in storms and atmospheric upheaval. Flood-like motifs appear not as global resets but as localized expressions of divine power. For cross-regional comparison, these traditions demonstrate how environmental context shapes the form and meaning of disaster narratives across the ancient Near East. The Near East was only one center of flood memory. Others emerged independently. The Mediterranean holds traces of coasts that no longer exist. Throughout the early Holocene, rising sea levels reshaped the shorelines of the Aegean Basin, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea region. As global ice sheets melted between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, water encroached across coastal plains, river valleys, and low-lying settlements. These changes did not occur in a single catastrophic event but through a series of transgressions that advanced gradually across centuries. Nevertheless, the archaeological record preserves evidence that communities living along these coasts experienced significant losses of land, losses that later generations may have remembered in oral traditions. Excavations and underwater surveys have revealed submerged settlements, fossilized forests, and ancient shorelines now hidden beneath meters of seawater, offering a material foundation for understanding how Mediterranean societies perceived rising waters. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis remains one of the most widely discussed examples. First proposed in the late 1990s, it suggested that a sudden inflow of Mediterranean water around 5,600 BCE rapidly flooded the Black Sea basin, transforming it from a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. According to this model, the breach of the Bosporus would have raised the sea level dramatically, inundating coastal communities in a relatively short period. Subsequent research has moderated these claims. Sediment cores, microfossil studies, and radiocarbon analyses now indicate that sea level rise in the Black Sea proceeded more gradually than the original catastrophic model proposed. While significant transgression occurred, it was neither instantaneous nor universally destructive. Still, the long-term submergence would have forced populations to relocate repeatedly, potentially contributing to narratives about abandoned coasts or lost homelands. Underwater archaeology across the Mediterranean supports the broader picture of gradual but persistent shoreline retreat. At Pavlopetri, off the coast of southern Laconia in Greece, researchers have documented one of the oldest known submerged towns, dating to around 3000 BCE. Its streets, building foundations, and courtyards remain visible beneath shallow water. The site was not destroyed all at once. Instead, Rising sea levels and coastal erosion slowly consumed the settlement. Pavlopetri illustrates how early coastal communities faced progressive environmental pressure that, over generations, could have motivated movements inland and shaped collective memory of disappearing land. The site of Atlityam, located off the coast of Israel, provides a similarly detailed window into early Holocene submergence. Occupied between roughly 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, it contains well-preserved structures, wells, and even intact human burials. Marine cores and coastal geomorphology indicate that its abandonment coincided with increasing sea levels that overtook the settlement. Atlityam demonstrates that early Neolithic communities along the eastern Mediterranean lived in dynamic coastal environments, where long-term inundation was an ongoing challenge rather than a singular event. The archaeological clarity of the site, with artifacts, architecture, and human remains preserved in situ, reinforces the scientific reliability of these interpretations. Across the Aegean Basin, geomorphological studies identify multiple ancient shorelines now submerged, along with beach ridges, caves, and freshwater springs that once existed above sea level. Sediment analysis from islands such as Crete, Naxos, and Cyprus indicates that sea level rise was punctuated by periods of relative stability, allowing communities to occupy coastal zones before abandoning them as waters advanced. These patterns suggest a complex population landscape marked by repeated relocations. While these movements lack the dramatic scale of Near Eastern flood narratives, they nonetheless represent significant environmental changes that early Mediterranean societies had to navigate. The interpretation of these submerged sites avoids sensational claims. There is no archaeological consensus supporting the notion of a single, region-wide Mediterranean deluge capable of generating a unified mythological tradition. Instead, evidence points to local and regional adjustments to rising seas, shaped by geological forces rather than abrupt catastrophe. The consistency of findings across multiple sites strengthens the conclusion that early Mediterranean populations adapted incrementally to environmental change, developing strategies for settlement relocation, resource management, and coastal exploitation. These long-term transformations provide a scientific context for understanding how later myths, legends, or cultural memories might incorporate themes of land loss or rising waters. However, the relationship between these archaeological patterns and later stories remains indirect. The evidence supports environmental pressures and coastal change, not the sweeping destruction characteristic of the Mesopotamian literary tradition. From a comparative perspective, the Mediterranean case demonstrates how sea level rise influenced human settlement patterns without producing a formalized flood myth on the scale found in riverine civilizations. By grounding interpretation in sediment cores, underwater archaeology, and radiocarbon sequencing, the archaeological record presents a coherent picture of early Holocene coastal transformations. These events were significant but gradual, shaping the lived experiences of coastal communities across millennia. Across the highlands of Iran and India, new flood traditions emerged. In ancient Iran, the flood became a freeze, a cosmic winter that reshaped humanity. Unlike the deluge narratives of Mesopotamia, the Iranian tradition preserved in the Vendidad presents a radically different form of catastrophe. Rather than an overwhelming surge of water, the threat takes the form of an all-encompassing winter sent by the destructive spirit Ungramenu. This event is recorded in Vendidad II, one of the oldest strata of Avestan literature, where the figure Yima, later Jamshid in Middle Persian tradition, receives divine instruction to prepare for a coming extinction-level cold. The absence of a literal flood does not diminish its significance. Instead, the narrative represents an Indo-Iranian reinterpretation of the global destruction motif, reframing environmental danger within the cosmological framework of Zoroastrian dualism. The Avestan passage describes how Ahura Mazda warns Yima of a deadly winter that will bury the world under deep snow and freeze the land. To preserve life, Yima is instructed to construct a vara, an enclosed refuge, large enough to shelter selected humans, animals, plants, and seeds. Unlike the Mesopotamian ark, which relies on buoyancy and survival through floodwaters, the vara is a terrestrial sanctuary, insulated from climate rather than water. Archaeologists and historians note that the text likely reflects environmental realities experienced by early Indo-Iranian populations living on the Central Asian steppe and Iranian plateau, where harsh winters and glaciation posed serious threats. The philological structure of the narrative suggests an Indo-European catastrophic template, adapted to the ecology and worldview of the Iranian cultural sphere. The significance of the Vara extends beyond its immediate survival function. The text presents Yima not only as a protector of humanity but also as a culture hero who expands the world and presides over an idealized pre-catastrophic age. Prior to the winter, Yima's reign is marked by abundance, the absence of disease, and the steady increase of population. The impending winter disrupts this golden age, providing the narrative's dramatic turning point. Scholars interpret this movement from prosperity to crisis as emblematic of Indo-Iranian cosmology, in which the balance between order, asha, and chaos, druj, is constantly threatened by destructive forces. The catastrophic winter, therefore, serves as a narrative manifestation of cosmic disorder, reinforcing the need for ritual, kingship, and moral stewardship. The textual evidence for this tradition is complex. The Vendidad incorporates layers of oral transmission, linguistic evolution, and theological reinterpretation. While some scholars argue that the Yima narrative preserves a distant echo of Indo-European flood motifs, others maintain it represents an independent tradition grounded in climatic memory rather than hydrological crisis. The structure of Ahura Mazda's warning, Yima's construction of the Vara, and the selective preservation of species echo broad Indo-European themes of survival through catastrophe. However, the uniquely Iranian framing, including the absence of guilt, divine punishment, or moral cleansing, marks a clear divergence from the moralized deluges of the Near East. Environmental context strengthens this interpretation. Paleoclimatic studies of the Iranian plateau and Central Asian highlands indicate periods of extreme cold and glacial advance during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. These oscillations would have impacted pastoral and early agricultural communities, shaping collective memory of environmental instability. While the Avestan winter cannot be correlated with a specific event, the narrative aligns with the ecological pressures known from the region. The choice to present catastrophe as cold rather than water reflects the priorities of societies for whom winter, not inundation, posed the existential threat. The Yima narrative also carries political implications. In later Zoroastrian literature, Jamshid becomes a royal figure whose moral decline leads to his overthrow by Zahak, a tyrant associated with demonic influence. The Vendidad version, however, retains an earlier and more idealized portrayal. Yima's task of building the Vara emphasizes his responsibility to safeguard life, positioning him as a righteous, divinely guided leader. This emphasis on kingship aligns with Indo-Iranian patterns in which rulers play a central role in maintaining cosmic and ecological stability. The catastrophe tests the leader's competence and reinforces a foundational belief in the moral duty of kings to protect the world from disorder. The absence of a flood in the Iranian tradition provides a crucial comparative insight. Rather than adopting the Mesopotamian model wholesale, the Indo-Iranian world preserved a structurally similar but ecologically distinct catastrophe narrative. This divergence supports the broader scholarly understanding that flood myths do not arise from a single origin point but from multiple regional experiences of environmental stress. The Iranian transformation of flood imagery into cosmic winter highlights the adaptability of Indo-European mythic frameworks and the centrality of local geography in shaping narrative forms. By emphasizing textual analysis, linguistic context, and paleo-environmental data, the Yima episode offers a clear example of how Indo-Iranian traditions reinterpreted the destruction and survival motif. It demonstrates continuity with broader Indo-European patterns while maintaining distinct theological features rooted in Zoroastrian cosmology. Further east, the Indo-Aryan world preserved its own version. Long before Noah, India told of Manu, saved by a fish god from rising waters. The Indian flood tradition is among the oldest and most influential in South Asian literature, appearing in early Vedic prose and later expanding through the Puranic corpus. Its earliest known form occurs in the Shatapatha Brahmana, circa 8th to 6th century BCE, where Manu, a primordial human ancestor, encounters a small fish that warns him of a coming deluge. This fish, later identified with the deity Vishnu, instructs Manu to build a vessel capable of preserving life and to prepare for a destructive flood that will wash away the existing world. Although the narrative shares structural features with Near Eastern flood myths, divine warning, vessel construction, and survival of a chosen figure, its cosmological framing remains distinctly Indian, embedded within a cyclical conception of time and creation. The Shatapatha Brahmana describes the encounter in practical and concise terms. Manu nurtures the fish from a tiny creature into a great being, at which point it reveals the impending disaster. When the flood arrives, Manu binds his vessel to the fish's horn, allowing it to guide him through the waters to safety. This detail, often emphasized by philologists, underscores the narrative's integration of divine guidance with natural symbolism. The fish, an aquatic being comfortable in floodwaters, functions as a protective force rather than a punitive agent. The Indian tradition, unlike its Mesopotamian counterpart, does not frame the flood as a response to human corruption or divine anger. Instead, the deluge is part of a broader cosmological cycle, reflecting the Vedic concept of destruction and renewal inherent in the structure of the universe. Later Puranic texts, including the Matsya Purana, Bhagavata Purana, and Agni Purana, expand the narrative considerably. These accounts identify the fish explicitly as an avatar of Vishnu, formalizing the connection between cosmic preservation and divine intervention. The Puranic version introduces new elements: the preservation of the Vedas, the role of the demon Hayagriva, and the establishment of post-Diluvian order. These additions reinforce the theological evolution occurring in early Hindu literature, in which Vishnu increasingly assumes the function of maintaining cosmic balance. The narrative's expansion across centuries illustrates how the flood theme became a flexible medium through which religious and philosophical developments could be articulated. Archaeological and environmental context provides further insight into the development of the Indian flood motif. The early Vedic period coincided with significant hydrological changes across the subcontinent. Studies along the Ghaggar-Hakra, often associated with the ancient Sarasvati, reveal shifting river courses during the late Holocene, while sediment analyses from the Ganges Basin document repeated flooding events affecting early agricultural communities. Although no single event can be directly connected to the Manu story, the broader environmental volatility likely contributed to oral traditions emphasizing water, destruction, and renewal. The Indian subcontinent's layered river systems, the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, and their tributaries, created conditions in which floods were both recurrent and transformative, shaping settlement patterns and economic life. The Manu narrative also provides an important case study in comparative mythology. While structural parallels with the Mesopotamian flood stories are apparent, the thematic orientation differs significantly. The Indian version emphasizes continuity rather than rupture. The flood does not signal the end of moral order but functions as a necessary reset within a perpetually renewing cosmos. This difference reflects the Indian worldview's integration of cyclical time, where creation, maintenance, and dissolution, often personified as Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, occur in repeated sequences. As a result, the flood becomes not a divine judgment but a component of cosmic rhythm. Philological analyses highlight the antiquity of the Indian tradition. The Shatapatha Brahmana, composed in early Iron Age India, preserves ritual and mythic material that likely originated in earlier Indo-Aryan oral traditions. Elements such as the divine fish, the role of Manu as progenitor, and the theme of guidance through catastrophe may reflect deeper Indo-Iranian or Indo-European motifs. However, unlike the Iranian narrative of Yma's Winter or the Greek tale of Deucalion, the Indian version retains a uniquely aquatic focus. This difference underscores the independent development of flood motifs in regions where rivers played central roles in subsistence, ritual life, and cosmological symbolism. The function of Manu as a cultural ancestor further strengthens the narrative's importance. In Vedic literature, Manu represents the archetypal lawgiver and progenitor of humanity. After the flood, he performs a sacrificial ritual from which a new form of life emerges, establishing the foundation for human society in the post-Diluvian world. This detail distinguishes the Indian story from many other traditions, where the survivor repopulates the world through familial descendants. In the Indian case, creation arises through ritual, emphasizing the cultural centrality of sacrifice, yajna, as a mechanism of cosmic order. The evolution of the Manu narrative across the Brahmanas and Puranas demonstrates how myth adapts to changing religious landscapes. Early Vedic ritualism gave way to Puric theism, and the flood story evolved accordingly. The basic framework, divine warning, vessel, survival, remained stable, but its theological significance expanded, reinforcing Vishnu's role in preserving cosmic stability. This transformation mirrors broader shifts in Indian religious history, illustrating how myth functions as a vehicle for doctrinal development. Records indicate that the Indian flood myth circulated widely across the subcontinent, appearing in multiple linguistic regions and cultural contexts. Its resilience may reflect its thematic flexibility, allowing different communities to interpret it through their own environmental experiences and ritual practices. The story's capacity to bridge Vedic ritualism with later devotional traditions contributed to its enduring influence. By the time writing systems became widespread in India, the Manu tradition had already passed through extensive periods of oral transmission, incorporating layers of ecological memory, ritual symbolism, and theological interpretation. Across East Asia, flood narratives took an even more foundational role. The Indus Basin was shaped by rivers that could nourish and devastate in the same breath. Along the floodplains of the Indus and its tributaries, entire cities rose from baked mud brick and carefully engineered drainage systems, their lives synchronized to a hydrological rhythm that could shift without warning. Archaeologists have long studied these cycles, not only to understand the remarkable urbanism of the Harappan world, but also to determine whether the subcontinent's own flood traditions emerged from genuine environmental trauma. And in the soil of these ancient riverbanks, the evidence is unmistakable. Periods of prosperity punctuated by phases of destruction, silt, and renewal. Mohenjo-daro offers the clearest window into this dynamic. Excavators found multiple strata of flood deposits, thick layers of fine silt and sandy wash laid down across streets, courtyards, and residential blocks. These layers were not the trace of a single great disaster but repeated inundations over centuries, each one powerful enough to require rebuilding. Some deposits are shallow veneers that suggest seasonal overflow. Others are heavy, water-laid blankets that imply a more violent surge, perhaps connected to a tectonic shift, a monsoon anomaly, or the Indus changing its course. The Great Bath and its surrounding structures, meticulously engineered to control water, appear in certain levels to have been partially buried by such floods. The people rebuilt again and again, adjusting platforms and raising floors in what must have been an exhausting cycle of resilience. At Kot Diji, farther upstream, the story is similar. Beneath the upper Harappan layers lies a destruction phase marked by fire and then followed by a deep, uniform silt deposit. Some scholars interpret this as a catastrophic river flood that destabilized the settlement, after which a new cultural horizon emerged. The silt is clean, water-sorted, and consistent with a high-energy flow event, one strong enough to erase much of what stood there before. This stratigraphy echoes what we see across the basin. Riverbank cities living at the mercy of channels that could shift across kilometers within a human lifetime. Other sites, Lothal, Kalibangan, and the low-lying settlements of Sindh show similar patterns. Lothal's dockyard, long debated, appears to have experienced significant flooding that deposited clay-rich sediments across the industrial quarter. At Kalibangan, archaeologists found distinct evidence of an early Harappan flood that buried mud-brick walls and forced the settlement's replanning. These layers are not mythical. They are sedimentary signatures of real, destructive waters interacting with a civilization that had mastered hydraulics but could not fully control the rivers they depended upon. What makes the Indus evidence especially compelling is how well the geological record aligns with environmental models for the mid-3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE. Around 2200 to 1900 BCE, climatic shifts affected monsoon strength, altering the flood regimes of the Indus system. In some regions, Rivers became more erratic. In others, they migrated away entirely, leaving settlements stranded. Such stresses would have disrupted trade, agriculture, and urban provisioning, the very foundations of Harappan life. While no known text from the Indus civilization survives to tell us how they interpreted these events, the material record suggests that their world could indeed deliver floods capable of shaping cultural memory. Whether these geological realities inspired later Indian flood narratives remains an open question. The Harappans left no written mythological corpus, and the Vedic and Puranic traditions arose centuries later, shaped by new peoples with different cosmologies. Yet the physical experience of living beside unstable rivers, of watching waters rise unpredictably, of rebuilding cities on elevating mounds, may have created a cultural atmosphere in which flood stories found fertile ground. Even in societies without direct textual continuity, landscapes preserve memory. People inherit stories from the land as much as from their ancestors. The Indus Basin, then, offers a rare case where myth and sediment can be compared directly. The archaeological layers show us a civilization repeatedly challenged by the very rivers that sustained it, a world in which a sudden surge of water could end a season, topple a district, or bury a neighborhood overnight. Whatever the ancient inhabitants believed, the terrain itself carried the logic of a flood myth. Power, vulnerability, renewal, and the constant negotiation between human order and natural force. China carried one of the world's most politically influential flood stories. On the Yellow River, the landscape itself was unstable, constantly remade by water. No other major river system has shaped the history of a civilization so profoundly through its volatility. While many ancient societies feared their floods, the peoples of northern China lived with a river that behaved unlike any other on Earth. A waterway so heavily burdened with silt that its very channel rose above the surrounding plains, drifting sideways over centuries, breaking loose in catastrophic bursts, and carving new courses across hundreds of kilometers. To understand why China produced one of the world's most influential flood legends, we must begin with this geological reality. In the North China Plain, water did not simply arrive. It transformed the world. The Yellow River earns its name from the vast quantities of loess it carries, fine, wind-blown dust that blankets the highlands of the Loess Plateau. When rains fall on this fragile landscape, entire hillsides erode into the river's tributaries, feeding an enormous sediment load into the main channel. This natural process gives the river its opaque yellow color, but more importantly, it raises its bed year after year. As sediment accumulates, the river loses depth and gains breadth, pushing outward against its banks until pressure and elevation differences become too great. The result is a breach, sudden and violent, that sends water spilling across the plain in a sheet-like front, obliterating fields, villages, and paths before settling into a new course. To live near such a river was to inhabit a land of perpetual uncertainty. These geomorphological forces were already shaping human communities long before recorded history. Across the Neolithic period, particularly during the Yangshao, circa 5000 to 3000 BCE, and Longshan, circa 3000 to 1900 BCE, cultures, settlements clustered along tributaries and terraces that offered a balance between water access and defensive height. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous habitations perched above ancient flood levels, suggesting that early farmers quickly learned to respect the river's caprice. Yet even elevated sites were not always safe. Excavations in parts of Hunan, Shaanxi, and Shaanxi reveal thick layers of yellowish-gray silt blanketing pottery floors and hearths, sometimes extending across entire settlement horizons. These are the signatures of major inundations, waters laden with loess-derived sediment that poured over the plains and settled across open ground as the currents slowed. At sites like Banpo and Jiangzhai, such deposits indicate repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Further evidence comes from deep cores taken across the lower Yellow River basin. These cores capture thousands of years of sedimentation, alternating layers of river silts, stable soils, and flood pulses that appear as abrupt, coarser-grained wedges. Some pulses are thin, consistent with seasonal overbank flooding. Others represent events of much greater magnitude, perhaps tied to climatic anomalies or to sudden channel avulsions. Moments when the river abandoned one path entirely and burst into another. These events were capable of drowning hundreds of square kilometers in water and mud, erasing fields and reshaping entire landscapes. They were not rare. The river's high sediment regime ensured that over centuries, a cycle of rise, breach, and relocation repeated with almost geological regularity. During the Longshan period, when population densities increased and settlements grew more complex, the consequences of these floods intensified. Archaeological layers show not only silt deposits but also evidence of social stress. Abandoned homes, destroyed storage pits, and rebuilding phases that suggest communities were forced to reorganize after sudden environmental shocks. In some regions, these disruptions may have encouraged political centralization. Communities that could coordinate labor for levee building, flood management, and agricultural recovery likely gained advantages over scattered hamlets, still vulnerable to the river's unpredictability. The earliest forms of social hierarchy in northern China may owe as much to environmental necessity as to any cultural innovation. It is within this context that the geological evidence of a particularly significant flood event near Jisher Gorge, dated by some studies to around 1920 BCE, has drawn considerable attention. Although not universally accepted, the stratigraphy at the Lagia site and along the upper Yellow River suggests a sudden, high-energy flood pulse following an earthquake-induced landslide dam burst. The force of that outpouring carved new channels, deposited enormous gravel fans, and may have sent downstream surges into the wider basin. Whether this event directly corresponds to the legendary Great Flood, described in early Chinese texts, remains uncertain, but it illustrates the kind of extraordinary disaster the river was capable of generating. Even a single such event could have shaped memories for generations, embedding stories of heroic intervention, collective struggle, and the need for coordinated authority. What emerges from the archaeological and hydrological record is a picture of a river system that demanded constant adaptation. The Neolithic peoples of the North China Plain were not passive victims of their environment. They developed irrigation networks, constructed terraces, and selected settlement locations with care. Yet the river remained unpredictable. Its floods were not steady, seasonal cycles like the Nile's. They were catastrophic ruptures, capable of wiping away decades of labor. Living under these conditions fostered a cultural expectation that water required management, that order must be imposed upon chaos, and that human ingenuity could, perhaps must, intervene to tame the river. This worldview created fertile ground for the emergence of a mythic narrative that linked political legitimacy to hydrological mastery. When early Chinese texts describe sages or proto-kings confronting a vast flood, they are drawing upon a deep, lived reality. The landscape itself provided the script: water rising beyond control, land swallowed beneath mud, and the promise that stability could be restored only through extraordinary leadership. These conditions framed one of history's most crucial flood legends. In early China, taming the flood meant earning the right to rule. No episode in early Chinese tradition illustrates this principle more clearly than the account of Yu the Great, whose struggle against a vast inundation served not merely as a tale of heroism but as the ideological foundation for dynastic authority. The earliest references to this narrative appear in texts compiled long after the events they describe, yet their consistency in linking political legitimacy to hydraulic control underscores the central role water played in early state formation. Examining the Shurji, the Bamboo Annals, and other early sources reveals how deeply the flood narrative shaped China's understanding of governance. The Shurji, compiled by Sima Qian during the Han Dynasty, presents the flood as an enduring crisis that spanned generations. According to this account, the inundation began under Emperor Yao, whose officials struggled unsuccessfully to contain the waters. The task eventually fell to Gun, a figure portrayed as ambitious but ultimately ineffective. His efforts to construct embankments are described as inadequate, implying that attempting to wall off the waters without understanding their dynamics was destined to fail. This failure sets the stage for Yu, Gun's son, whose contrasting approach, channeling water rather than blocking it, forms the core of the mytho-historical transformation. The narrative constructs a clear contrast between two philosophies: resistance versus redirection. Yu's success is framed as evidence of superior judgment and mastery of environmental forces. The Bamboo Annals, though fragmentary and subject to scholarly debate regarding authenticity and reconstruction, provide additional context. In some versions, the annals place the flood in the late 3rd millennium BCE and attribute to Yu a detailed program of surveying mountains, dividing regions, and coordinating labor across vast territories. While the text's chronology remains contested, its emphasis on administrative order suggests that Yu's achievement was interpreted as much bureaucratic as hydraulic. The flood becomes an organizing principle around which the earliest territorial framework of China is imagined. This connection between environmental management and political unity would remain a lasting theme in Chinese historiography. Other early works, including portions of the Shangshu, Book of Documents, reinforce this portrayal. These texts describe Yu traveling extensively, inspecting river systems, clearing channels, and guiding floodwaters into the sea. This image of a leader moving through the landscape, assessing conditions firsthand, presents a model of rulership grounded in practical competence. It also reflects an early recognition that the river system required coordinated intervention rather than isolated, local solutions. The narrative's persistence across sources suggests that by the early 1st millennium BCE, Yu had become a symbol for collective labor and centralized authority. From a political standpoint, the story serves a clear purpose. By crediting the establishment of order to Yu, the founder of the Xia dynasty, later writers provided a mythic foundation for hereditary rule. The flood's resolution marks the moment when authority shifted from loosely connected tribal polities to a more unified structure under a single figure. In this sense, the narrative functions as a charter myth, justifying centralized power by situating it within a narrative of environmental restoration. Stabilizing the landscape becomes synonymous with stabilizing society. The implication is that only a capable, morally upright leader can transform chaos into order. This linkage between moral authority and hydraulic competence is further reinforced by the contrast with Gun's failure. According to some versions, Gun defied heavenly instructions or pursued misguided techniques. By juxtaposing his failed embankments with Yu's successful dredging and channeling, early writers underscored a broader ideological message. Alignment with natural principles yields success, while defiance or misunderstanding brings disaster. This distinction mirrors the concept of the mandate of heaven that would later dominate Chinese political thought. Though the mandate doctrine emerges fully in the Zhou period, its conceptual roots can be traced to these earlier depictions of rightful governance demonstrated through environmental mastery. Archaeological findings offer partial support for the backdrop implied by these texts. Across northern China, material evidence indicates that early communities faced significant hydrological challenges between roughly 3000 and 1900 BCE. Settlement disruptions, thick silt deposits, and shifting river courses point to a prolonged era of instability consistent with oral traditions of a great flood. While these data cannot confirm the actions of an individual leader, they demonstrate that widespread inundations were part of the lived experience from which such narratives could arise. The magnitude of environmental change offered fertile ground for political explanations built around leadership and collective organization. Interpretively, Yu's story illustrates how societies use environmental crises to articulate political ideals. The flood becomes more than a natural event. It becomes a test of legitimacy. By resolving it, Yu embodies the qualities later dynasties sought to associate with themselves: diligence, technical skill, restraint, and responsiveness to natural conditions. This framing is not unique to China. Many ancient cultures linked leadership to control over water. However, the systematic way Chinese texts integrate hydraulic engineering into the very definition of rulership sets this tradition apart. The narrative also reflects early knowledge of the river's behavior. The emphasis on dredging channels aligns with an understanding, however rudimentary, of how sediment accumulation elevates the riverbed. Yu's work to open paths for the water parallels later historical efforts to manage the Yellow River through diversion and channel maintenance. This suggests that the myth preserved technical memories alongside political ideals. Even if dramatically condensed or transformed, the account reflects a genuine recognition of the environmental challenges posed by the river system. One of the most striking aspects of Yu's portrayal is its scale. The texts describe him dividing the land into 9 provinces, coordinating the work of countless laborers, and mapping mountains and waterways. While these details likely reflect later administrative models projected back into the past, they underscore the belief that addressing the flood required a level of organization beyond any local community. The flood narrative thus anticipates key features of early Chinese statecraft: centralized coordination, regionally differentiated administration, and the integration of natural geography into political ideology. By the time the Shurji codified these stories, Yu had become a figure whose legacy extended far beyond the Xia dynasty, serving as a symbol of ideal governance. His successful management of the flood justified both his personal authority and the dynastic order he founded. Regardless of the historicity of specific details, the narrative's endurance demonstrates the central role that environmental control played in conceptualizations of political legitimacy. Modern science now offers new ways to evaluate these ancient accounts. A single catastrophic outburst may have echoed across generations of storytellers. This possibility gained new attention after a 2016 study examining geological layers at Jishur Gorge in the upper Yellow River Basin suggested the occurrence of a sudden, high-magnitude flood around 1920 BCE. The research team, combining stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and geomorphological modeling, argued that the event resulted from the collapse of a landslide-dammed paleolake. Their findings offered the most concrete scientific evidence yet proposed for a natural disaster of exceptional scale in early Bronze Age China. While the study does not prove a direct link to the Great Flood tradition recorded in later texts, it provides an environmental scenario that aligns chronologically and geographically with the region where those traditions were later centered. The study's core evidence derives from sedimentary deposits found along the Yellow River's upper reaches, particularly at locations where sudden high-energy flow would have left distinctive geological signatures. Researchers identified coarse gravels, imbricated boulders, and debris layers inconsistent with typical seasonal flooding. These materials rested above older, stable surfaces and were sealed beneath subsequent fine-grained silts, suggesting a single, rapid episode rather than periodic accumulation. Radiocarbon samples taken from organic material within the pre-flood surface yielded dates clustering around 2000 BCE, while samples from younger materials above the flood layer pointed to an event near 1900 BCE. The consistency of these dates strengthened the interpretation of a temporally constrained flood pulse. One interpretive insight from the study concerns the mechanism of the lake's formation. Geological mapping revealed evidence of a massive landslide that had blocked a major Yellow River tributary. Such blockages, though short-lived, can create substantial temporary lakes. In this case, the reconstructed paleolake is estimated to have stored several cubic kilometers of water. The sudden failure of the natural dam, likely triggered by ongoing erosion or seismic activity, would have produced a catastrophic release. Modeling of the resulting outburst suggests peak flows far exceeding the river's typical discharge, with the potential to devastate downstream settlements. This mechanism differs significantly from slow, rainfall-driven flooding and more closely resembles high-energy floods known from other tectonically active regions. According to the study, the effects of such an outburst could have been felt far downstream. The researchers proposed that floodwaters would have surged through the middle reaches of the Yellow River, with destructive consequences for Neolithic communities. Archaeological sites in the region show evidence of repeated abandonment and rebuilding during the early 2nd millennium BCE, though the causes vary. While not all such disruptions can be attributed to hydrological events, the pattern suggests that environmental stress was a recurring factor. The 2016 study introduced a specific, time-bound event into this broader context, offering one possible catalyst for cultural change. A second interpretive insight arises from the location of Jishur Gorge itself. Though the site lies at the river's upper reaches, far from the core areas associated with the Yu the Great tradition, the gorge belongs to the same hydrological system that ultimately shaped life in the Central Plains. The idea that a dramatic event far upstream could influence downstream perceptions underscores the interconnected nature of early river communities. Even if the outburst flood did not directly destroy settlements in the Xia heartland, its impact on sediment load, channel morphology, or seasonal flow patterns could have contributed to environmental instability. This broader perspective aligns with what is known about the Yellow River's long-term behavior. Changes in one part of the basin often propagate through the system. Archaeological findings support the existence of hydrological stress during this period. Sites associated with the late Longshan and early Erlita cultures reveal alternating phases of occupation and decline. Some settlements exhibit thick silt deposits consistent with inundation, while others show evidence of shifting habitation zones. Radiocarbon chronologies compiled from multiple locations suggest that the centuries around 2000 to 1800 BCE were marked by significant environmental variability. Although these patterns cannot be tied exclusively to a single flood, they reinforce the idea that early communities experienced frequent and sometimes severe hydrological disturbances. A third interpretive insight concerns the relationship between scientific evidence and later textual traditions. The earliest written accounts of Yu the Great date from more than a millennium after the proposed 1920 BCE flood. Oral traditions may preserve memories of events across long spans, but such memories are often shaped by subsequent social and political developments. The 2016 study does not claim that the outburst flood is the Great Flood. Rather, it argues that a real, extreme event could have contributed to a broader cultural memory of environmental upheaval. This distinction is important for understanding how geophysical realities intersect with myth-making processes. Mythic narratives often synthesize multiple experiences: seasonal flooding, settlement disruptions, and exceptional catastrophes into a single foundational story. Skepticism remains among some researchers regarding the scale and downstream effects of the Jishur Gorge event. Critics point out that reconstructing ancient flood magnitudes involves uncertainties, especially when relying on sedimentary proxies that can form under a range of conditions. Additionally, some argue that the flood's geographical distance from the Central Plains complicates direct historical connections. However, even these critiques acknowledge that the Yellow River Basin experienced substantial hydrological variability during the early Bronze Age. The central question is not whether floods occurred, they clearly did, but whether one particular event played an outsized role in shaping cultural narratives. The 2016 study further discusses the timing of the Erlita culture, often associated with the archaeological counterpart of the Xia. The proposed flood date around 1920 BCE overlaps with the transition from late Neolithic societies to early Bronze Age polities. Some researchers suggest that major environmental disruptions could have accelerated political consolidation, prompting communities to organize collectively in response to increased instability. This interpretation aligns with broader anthropological observations. Large-scale disasters can catalyze institutional development as leadership, coordination, and resource management become more critical. If so, Yu's narrative may encode collective responses to real environmental challenges rather than the actions of a single historical figure. Radiocarbon datasets continue to refine the chronological framework for early Chinese cultures, and ongoing analyses may clarify whether hydrological events cluster around key cultural transitions. Sediment cores from lakes and riverbeds across northern China show signals of environmental stress during the same general time frame, including increased erosion, higher sedimentation rates, and shifts in pollen assemblages. These independent lines of evidence reinforce the notion that early 2nd millennium BCE communities faced substantial ecological pressures. Although linking individual layers to specific narrative episodes remains challenging, the correspondence between environmental change and socio-political transformation is well established. In evaluating the significance of the 2016 findings, the key contribution lies in the integration of geological, radiocarbon, and archaeological methods. By anchoring the flood hypothesis in empirical data, the study offers a rare opportunity to compare textual traditions with physical evidence. It does not close the debate but expands the discussion by providing a credible environmental event that fits within the broader chronological landscape. As further research refines sediment models and improves radiocarbon calibration curves, the connection between large-scale floods and early-state formation may become clearer. The flood story was global, and Oceania preserves some of the most striking examples. Across the Pacific, the flood motif appears as voyages of survival. Among Polynesian and Micronesian cultures, oral traditions consistently preserve stories of catastrophic waters reshaping the islands, sometimes threatening entire communities and prompting extraordinary responses. These narratives, collected over the past century by ethnographers and linguists, reveal a recurrent theme: the use of watercraft to navigate rising seas and preserve life, whether human, animal, or sacred objects. The stories are not uniform, yet the underlying structure, a localized disaster mitigated by skill, courage, and communal effort, suggests a deep, region-wide memory of environmental instability. In Hawaii, for example, several chants and genealogical accounts recount a great deluge in which specific lineages survived by taking to canoes. The Kumalipo, a foundational cosmogonic chant, contains references to periods of inundation that align with genealogical markers and ancestral migrations. While poetic elements are present, the text emphasizes continuity and the survival of particular families, suggesting that the story preserves collective memory of localized floods, high surf, or storm-driven inundations. Similarly, oral narratives from Samoa describe extreme rainfall events that forced inhabitants to seek elevated ground or utilize canoes to reach safety. In some cases, these accounts include details of transporting sacred or ritual objects, emphasizing that the flood threatened both life and the social religious order. The Gilbert Islands, in the Central Pacific, provide additional evidence for a shared deluge motif. Islanders recount episodes of rising tides that inundated low-lying atolls, forcing survivors to migrate temporarily or permanently. Anthropologists have noted structural similarities among these accounts: sudden onset, communal action, reliance on watercraft, and post-event restoration of settlements. These recurring patterns suggest that even small-scale environmental hazards, storm surges, typhoon-driven waves, or temporary oceanic flooding, were incorporated into narrative memory, subsequently transmitted over generations. The functional logic of these tales often revolves around preparation, skill, and social cohesion, reflecting both practical and moral dimensions. Interpretive analysis indicates that these specific narratives may encode long-term environmental experience rather than a single catastrophic event. Rising sea levels during the mid- to late Holocene altered the geography of many islands, permanently submerging reefs, low-lying coastlines, and freshwater sources. Oral traditions likely preserved observations of shifting shorelines, increased storm impact, and episodic inundations, translating ecological knowledge into culturally meaningful forms. From this perspective, the motif of survival by canoe functions as both mnemonic device and practical guide, ensuring that communities retained critical information about local hydrology, seasonal hazards, and navigational techniques. Comparative anthropology highlights several commonalities across widely separated islands. First, the flood motif frequently intersects with genealogical memory. Survivors are often ancestors of current lineages, emphasizing continuity and cultural legitimacy. Second, the narrative consistently portrays human agency as central. While divine or supernatural forces may be invoked, the resolution relies on skillful intervention, steering, provisioning, and organizing community labor. Third, these traditions display adaptability, allowing the motif to merge with other cosmological elements, such as creation myths, volcanic activity, or reef formation stories, without losing its identity as a flood narrative. These characteristics distinguish oceanic deluge tales from purely moralistic or punitive floods found elsewhere, framing them instead as integrated social-ecological memory. Linguistic and ethnographic work provides additional support for the antiquity of these traditions. Polynesian navigational chants, mnemonic devices, and genealogical recitations are structured to preserve information across multiple generations, often without written records. Flood motifs embedded within these oral systems may therefore reflect environmental experience accumulated over centuries or millennia. In some cases, islanders themselves identify certain stories as older than memory, suggesting a long-standing awareness of changing sea levels and hydrological hazards. Archaeological correlations, such as abandoned coastal sites or evidence of storm deposits, reinforce the plausibility of these accounts as memory traces of real environmental phenomena. At a regional level, these narratives illustrate a broader pattern of flood storytelling that parallels developments elsewhere in the world. While the scale of events in Oceania differs from the continental floods of China, Mesopotamia, or the Indian subcontinent, the underlying logic is comparable. Communities confronted extreme environmental stress, organized collective responses, and encoded those experiences in narrative form. In doing so, they preserved both practical survival strategies and culturally meaningful frameworks for understanding human-environment interaction. This dual function reflects the adaptive value of oral tradition in small island contexts, where knowledge of tides, rainfall, and storm behavior could determine survival. Taken together, the Polynesian and Micronesian flood traditions demonstrate that deluge narratives are not limited to continental river valleys or densely populated agrarian societies. Even in dispersed island systems, where permanent settlement is geographically constrained and hydrological hazards are episodic, flood memory emerges as a persistent and socially central motif. These stories integrate ecological observation, ancestral continuity, and communal coordination, establishing a distinctive narrative pattern that complements other global traditions while maintaining local specificity. To the west, Australia holds even older water memory traditions. In Australia, stories remember coasts that vanished thousands of years ago. Aboriginal oral traditions contain references to flooding, rising seas, and lost landscapes that predate written history by millennia. Linguists and anthropologists have noted that certain coastal myths, passed down through carefully maintained oral lineages, correspond with evidence of post-glacial sea level rise between approximately 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. These narratives frequently describe the inundation of plains, estuaries, and low-lying islands, suggesting that human communities were acutely aware of dramatic environmental transformations long before the advent of recorded history. One illustrative example comes from the Yolngu people of northern Australia. Their oral accounts recount ancestral beings reshaping the land and waterways, with specific references to areas now submerged beneath the Arafura and Timor seas. These narratives often include precise geographic markers, describing river mouths, islands, and coastal features that archaeologists have verified as submerged by rising sea levels during the early Holocene. Similar patterns appear among the Gunditjmara and other southern coastal groups, whose flood stories correspond with evidence of drowned river valleys and estuarine deposits along the southern coast. The convergence of oral detail and geomorphological evidence provides a compelling case for continuity between memory and environment. Linguistic analysis further supports the antiquity of these flood narratives. Certain place names, ceremonial terms, and story structures have remained remarkably stable across thousands of years, preserving key information about landscape changes long after the original event. These linguistic markers often encode both spatial and temporal data, allowing successive generations to locate ancestral sites and understand historical environmental conditions. The precision of these oral records demonstrates not only the cultural importance of coastal memory, but also the sophisticated mechanisms by which Aboriginal communities maintained environmental knowledge over deep time. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence aligns closely with these oral traditions. Submerged middens, shell deposits, and dune sequences document the retreat of the coastline and the progressive loss of habitable land to rising seas. Radiocarbon dating of these deposits places inundation events squarely within the timeframe referenced by Aboriginal narratives, suggesting that memory of these transformations could have been transmitted continuously for up to 10 millennia. In effect, oral tradition functioned as a repository of long-term environmental knowledge, preserving accounts of flood and inundation in ways that could inform settlement decisions, resource management, and cultural identity. Interpretive analysis highlights the unique longevity and resilience of these narratives. Unlike flood myths in riverine or urban contexts, which may evolve rapidly in response to political or religious pressures, Australian oral traditions were maintained within stable social frameworks where knowledge transmission was formalized through ceremony, song, and ritual. In Southeast Asia, rising seas transformed entire continents into islands. The region once known as Sundaland, comprising the modern Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and surrounding shallow shelves, was progressively submerged during the early to mid-Holocene as global sea levels rose by as much as 120 meters. Geological evidence indicates that coastal plains, river valleys, and low-lying plateaus became permanently inundated between approximately 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, reshaping human habitation patterns and prompting widespread adaptation. Submerged river channels, drowned caves, and sediment cores provide a clear record of these transformations, showing the scale and rapidity of environmental change. Archaeologists and geologists have identified multiple sites indicating early human occupation now lost beneath the sea. Offshore surveys in the Java Sea and along the Sunda Shelf reveal submerged settlements, shell middens, and lithic scatters corresponding to pre-Holocene coastlines. These features suggest that communities once lived in areas now hundreds of meters below current sea level, relying on coastal resources, freshwater systems, and riverine networks that disappeared with inundation. Caves such as those in Borneo and Sulawesi contain cultural deposits and charcoal layers indicating repeated occupation and episodes of water intrusion, consistent with rising seas or episodic flooding. These physical records provide an empirical framework for understanding why local populations retained narratives of inundation. Oral traditions in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines preserve remarkable correspondences to these geological events. In Borneo, for example, Dayak groups recount ancestral lands lost to the sea, often describing migrations from submerged valleys and low-lying plains. In the Philippines, Visayan and Tagalog stories describe islands forming from once contiguous land, with floodwaters separating communities and forcing resettlement. Similar narratives from the Malay Peninsula recount ancestral villages swallowed by water, emphasizing the survival of select lineages and the need for mobility and vigilance. While these accounts contain mythic elements, they frequently retain accurate geographic and environmental detail, suggesting a basis in historical observation. Interpretively, these Southeast Asian stories share structural features with other Holocene flood narratives. First, they preserve memory of large-scale environmental disruption rather than discrete, localized events. Second, they encode adaptive strategies, migration, settlement relocation, and resource management that allowed human populations to survive profound landscape change. Third, they integrate cosmological or ritual dimensions, attributing transformation to ancestral or spiritual forces, which reinforced social cohesion and transmitted knowledge across generations. The combination of empirical observation and cultural codification demonstrates how communities embedded environmental memory within long-lived oral traditions. Geological and archaeological synthesis supports the plausibility of these narratives. Bathymetric mapping, sediment cores, and paleoshoreline reconstructions confirm the existence of submerged plains and river networks described in oral memory. Radiocarbon dating of cave deposits, shells, and terrestrial features aligns with the timing inferred from stories, indicating that early human populations experienced significant habitat loss during Holocene sea level rise. In effect, these narratives represent an intersection of environmental reality and cultural preservation, allowing ancient human experiences to survive for thousands of years without written records. Southeast Asia's flood traditions illustrate a broader pattern of global memory transmission. Across islands and continental shelves, humans encoded direct observation of rising seas and catastrophic inundation into story forms that could persist over millennia. These narratives function both as cautionary frameworks and as repositories of adaptive knowledge, ensuring continuity of social and ecological information despite dramatic environmental change. By integrating geological data with ethnographic records, researchers can trace the contours of early human awareness of climate-driven landscape transformation. With the global survey complete, attention shifts to the most influential Western version. The biblical flood is not one story, but two intertwined traditions. In Genesis 6-9, the narrative presents a complex fusion of literary strands that scholars have identified as stemming primarily from the Yahwist, J, and priestly P sources. Textual criticism reveals that these sources differ in chronology, focus, and theological emphasis, yet they were combined in the final Pentateuchal compilation to produce a cohesive, canonical account. Understanding this dual composition is essential for situating the biblical flood within both its historical milieu and the broader context of ancient Near Eastern flood narratives. The Yahweh source, often dated to the early 1st millennium BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah, emphasizes divine-human interaction and moral causality. In this strand, God observes the corruption of humankind, expresses regret at creation's deterioration, and selects Noah as a righteous survivor. The narrative stresses ethical responsibility, Noah's obedience, the preservation of life, and the covenantal promise after the flood reflect theological concerns about morality, divine justice, and human accountability. The Yahweh's passages present the flood as a narrative of judgment, warning, and renewal, with detailed descriptions of human and animal survival, the flood's duration, and post-deluge sacrifice. In contrast, the priestly source, usually associated with exilic or post-exilic scribal circles, introduces structural and chronological precision. He provides exact measurements for the ark, counts of animals, and the delineation of days and months, reflecting an interest in order, ritual observance, and genealogical continuity. Where J presents narrative fluidity and anthropomorphic depictions of God, P imposes a formal, almost systematic framework. The flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights, the waters prevail for 150 days, and Noah's lineage is enumerated in precise terms. These details demonstrate the priestly concern with cosmic and social order, emphasizing that survival is not only moral but also structured, ritualized, and tied to divine law. Linguistic analysis further distinguishes the two sources. Scholars note variations in the Hebrew vocabulary for God, YHWH in the Yahweh's passages, Elohim in the priestly sections, as well as differences in terminology for the floodwaters, the ark, and sacrificial acts. The repetition of phrases such as, "and God said," in P contrasts with the more narrative-driven style of J, suggesting divergent authorship and editorial intent. These linguistic markers allow scholars to trace how multiple traditions were interwoven, producing a layered text that addresses both theological and practical concerns within the ancient Israelite community. Chronologically, the biblical flood is framed in genealogical terms, linking Noah's family to Adam and situating the flood within a proto-historical framework. The narrative emphasizes continuity. Post-flood humanity is not entirely new but the continuation of a chosen lineage, preserved through divine intervention. This genealogical framing mirrors similar concerns in Mesopotamian traditions, where flood survivors like Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim are often placed within dynastic or ancestral sequences. The biblical account thus participates in a wider cultural pattern, blending local theological concerns with inherited narrative structures. Comparative textual study highlights thematic parallels with Mesopotamian flood narratives. The selection of a righteous individual or family, the divine motivation to destroy corrupt humanity, the construction of a vessel, the preservation of animal life, and the eventual restoration of the world are motifs shared across cultures. Yet the Hebrew narrative adapts these elements to a distinct monotheistic framework, emphasizing covenant, ethical responsibility, and the moral relationship between God and humanity. The fusion of J and P sources allows the narrative to balance storytelling, ritual observance, and theological reflection, producing a text both morally instructive and structurally coherent. Symbolism in the Hebrew flood extends beyond the narrative events. The ark functions as both a literal and metaphorical vessel. It preserves life, embodies divine protection, and represents order amidst chaos. The floodwaters symbolize judgment and cleansing, yet also the potential for renewal and covenantal fidelity. The rainbow, introduced at the conclusion of the story, codifies the divine promise, linking environmental phenomena to moral and religious principles. In combining J's ethical emphasis with P's structural rigor, the text encodes multiple layers of meaning, allowing readers to interpret the flood in moral, historical, and ritual terms. The integration of the two sources reflects broader editorial processes within ancient Israelite historiography. Compilers of the Pentateuch sought to harmonize diverse traditions while preserving distinct voices. In the flood narrative, this harmonization produces both narrative richness and theological depth. The story functions as history, myth, and moral exemplar simultaneously. It demonstrates how ancient communities used inherited motifs, flood, survival, divine judgment, to articulate cultural identity, reinforce social norms, and frame human-environment interactions in moral terms. The final composition also shows awareness of its Mesopotamian environment. References to boat building, the survival of life, and divine communication reflect knowledge of wider Near Eastern flood traditions circulating in Babylonian and Assyrian contexts. Yet the biblical account is carefully localized. Its geography, genealogical focus, and theological interpretations transform inherited motifs into an Israelite worldview. The fusion of Yahwist and priestly elements enables the narrative to speak both to immediate historical concerns, ethics, covenant, community continuity, and to inherited cultural memory, producing a text that is at once canonical, instructive, and historically resonant. The narrative was shaped by its Mesopotamian environment. In the Near East, floods explain divine order, but each culture shaped that order differently. Comparative study of Mesopotamian and Hebrew texts reveals both striking parallels and deliberate divergences, highlighting how societies adapted shared motifs to meet distinct theological, social, and political objectives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, and the Sumerian king list preserve detailed flood narratives that predate the final compilation of Genesis, suggesting that the Hebrew authors inherited a well-established corpus of flood motifs while simultaneously reshaping them for Israelite purposes. In the Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE, the flood arises from divine frustration at human overpopulation and noise. The gods, portrayed as capricious yet accountable to a divine council, deploy the waters to restore balance. The flood is framed as punishment but also as a mechanism to maintain cosmic order, with humanity's survival contingent upon compliance with divine instruction. Similarly, in the standard Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, circa 1200 to 1000 BCE, the character Utnapishtim recounts a great deluge sent by the gods to eradicate humanity. He constructs a boat under divine guidance, preserves animals, and restores human continuity, closely mirroring motifs later found in the biblical text. These narratives emphasize human vulnerability, the arbitrariness of divine decision-making, and the role of ritual obedience in survival. Genesis 6-9 shares several structural elements with these earlier epics. The selection of a single righteous family, the construction of a vessel, the preservation of animals, and the eventual repopulation of the world are motifs directly comparable to Mesopotamian models. Scholars have identified linguistic and conceptual parallels, such as the pitching of the ark in Genesis and the waterproofing described in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, or the sequence of sending out birds to test for dry land. These correspondences indicate that the Hebrew tradition participated in a broader Near Eastern narrative ecosystem, drawing on shared cultural memory and oral storytelling conventions. Yet significant divergences underscore the distinctive theological objectives of the biblical account. Unlike Mesopotamian texts, where multiple gods negotiate or debate, Genesis presents a single, sovereign deity acting with ethical purpose. The flood is not a capricious display of divine whim but a deliberate response to moral corruption. The emphasis on covenantal promise, the post-flood rainbow, and the moral responsibility of humanity frames the event as instructive rather than arbitrary. In this way, the Hebrew narrative transforms inherited flood motifs into a vehicle for monotheistic moral theology, reinforcing communal identity and ethical behavior rather than illustrating cosmic caprice. Geographical and environmental context further differentiates the traditions. Mesopotamian cities, built along the Tigris and Euphrates, were repeatedly affected by seasonal and catastrophic floods, providing direct experiential grounding for flood motifs. Archaeological layers at Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak demonstrate repeated inundations, which likely informed early narratives such as the Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis. In contrast, the Hebrew text situates the flood within a more generalized setting, Mount Ararat, without detailed hydrological reference to the local rivers. This abstraction emphasizes universal moral principles rather than immediate environmental experience, illustrating a theological rather than topographical focus. Interpretively, The divergence between Mesopotamian and Hebrew floods demonstrates how narratives are adapted to serve specific social and ideological needs. In Mesopotamia, floods justify divine authority, reinforce hierarchy among gods, and explain cycles of destruction and renewal. In Israelite tradition, the flood justifies monotheistic ethical governance, the legitimacy of covenantal law, and the preservation of a righteous lineage. This transformation reflects broader cultural priorities, where Mesopotamian epics negotiate human-divine relationships in a polytheistic context. Genesis establishes a moral framework anchored in a single deity and a covenantal ethic. Material evidence from the ancient Near East complements textual analysis. Excavations at early Bronze Age sites reveal sedimentary layers consistent with substantial flooding events. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic studies suggest episodes of river overbank flooding, high-energy water deposits, and occasional abrupt inundations, particularly along the southern Tigris-Euphrates system. While these layers cannot confirm any single narrative, they provide empirical context for why flood motifs were culturally resonant and repeatedly recorded. The convergence of environmental reality and literary memory underlines the adaptive function of flood stories in explaining human vulnerability and environmental unpredictability. A second analytical observation involves narrative transmission. The Hebrew authors did not merely copy Mesopotamian accounts but reinterpreted motifs through selective adaptation. By integrating ritual, genealogy, and moral reflection, Genesis constructs a flood story that is both familiar and distinct. The interplay of source materials, Yahwist and priestly traditions, further reflects this adaptive process, blending inherited narrative elements with Israelite theological innovation. The result is a text that retains the structural skeleton of regional flood narratives, while redefining their purpose in ethical, covenantal, and monotheistic terms. Finally, the comparison highlights a shared cultural function. Floods serve as explanatory devices for human history, social order, and divine human interaction. Across Mesopotamia and Israel, floods codify lessons about obedience, survival, and legitimacy. However, the theological lens shapes interpretation. Polytheistic narratives focus on negotiation and cosmic balance, whereas the Hebrew narrative emphasizes moral causality and divine sovereignty. Understanding these distinctions clarifies how Genesis both participates in and transforms Near Eastern literary and cultural traditions, producing a flood story that is at once derivative and original. What evidence exists for a real event underlying the biblical account? Archaeology reveals floods, but not a single world-ending deluge. Excavations throughout the Tigris-Euphrates basin demonstrate that flooding was a persistent feature of the southern Mesopotamian environment, yet it rarely resembled the catastrophic, global inundation described in myth. Early dynastic settlements such as Ur, Kish, Lagash, and Shuruppak provide extensive stratigraphic evidence of episodic inundation, including thick alluvial deposits, water-laid silt layers, and reworked occupational surfaces. These layers indicate that the region's inhabitants repeatedly adapted to water-level fluctuations, using raised platforms, mud-brick architecture, and drainage systems to mitigate environmental risk. Archaeological analysis confirms that floods were disruptive but typically localized, reflecting river dynamics rather than a universal deluge. Geomorphological studies reveal the role of river avulsion in shaping flood risk. The Tigris and Euphrates, carrying high sediment loads, frequently shifted channels and created new distributaries across the alluvial plain. These avulsions produced transient lakes, marshes, and overflow zones, periodically inundating settlements while leaving adjacent areas habitable. Sediment cores and stratigraphic sequences demonstrate that major avulsion events could deposit several meters of silt over decades, drastically altering the landscape and prompting the relocation or reconstruction of urban centers. Such environmental volatility likely contributed to the cultural memory of floods and informed the narrative motifs that later appeared in Mesopotamian literature. Low-lying marsh ecology further influenced flood exposure. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates that early cities were interspersed with marshlands, reed beds, and seasonal wetlands, which functioned as both resources and hazards. These marshes facilitated agriculture and fishing but were susceptible to rapid inundation during periods of excessive rainfall or upstream discharge. Archaeologists have documented infrastructure such as canals, levees, and raised platforms designed to manage water and maintain productive land. The presence of these systems demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, highlighting human resilience and agency in responding to recurrent flooding rather than passive victimhood. Radiocarbon dating of organic material within flood-deposited sediments provides a temporal framework for these events. In Shuruppak, for instance, a substantial alluvial layer has been dated to approximately 2900 to 2600 BCE, coinciding with the later Sumerian flood narratives. Similarly, evidence from Kish and Ur suggests recurrent high water events throughout the early dynastic period. While these episodes were severe enough to disrupt urban life, they were neither global in scope nor catastrophic on the scale implied by mythic accounts. The archaeological record indicates variability in magnitude, timing, and geographic impact, emphasizing that floods were a regular environmental challenge rather than a singular, cosmically significant occurrence. Interpretive analysis suggests that the Mesopotamian flood myths may have synthesized multiple, localized events into cohesive narrative memory. The repetition of catastrophic layers across urban sites could have been observed and transmitted orally, gradually forming the template for the Sumerian king lists, flood dividing line, and subsequent epics such as Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. By linking episodic hydrological stress with divine action, communities encoded experiential knowledge into story form, explaining environmental hazards while reinforcing social norms and religious authority. This approach illustrates the adaptive function of myth in societies where environmental unpredictability posed a recurring challenge to survival and governance. Hydrological modeling further clarifies the scale of flooding. Studies indicate that peak discharges in the Tigris and Euphrates during the early dynastic period could exceed seasonal norms by several times, inundating settlements within floodplains but rarely extending beyond the alluvial margin. Modern comparisons to controlled levee systems and ancient canal networks demonstrate that these floods were significant enough to necessitate substantial engineering responses. Such interventions, artificial levees, diversion channels, and elevated habitations, highlight a proactive, technological adaptation to environmental stress rather than the passive devastation described in mythic narratives. A second interpretive insight concerns societal impact. Flood layers often correspond with phases of urban renewal, reconstruction, and consolidation. In Ur, archaeological evidence suggests that rebuilding after inundation included standardized architectural elements and enhanced drainage, indicating institutionalized responses to environmental crises. Rather than erasing populations, floods acted as selective pressures, shaping urban planning, labor organization, and communal cohesion. This observation reinforces the distinction between historical reality and the mythic imagination of total annihilation, demonstrating how recurring floods informed both material culture and narrative memory. Comparisons with neighboring regions support a broader understanding of Mesopotamian flood dynamics. Sites in Elam and along the Tigris tributaries reveal similar sedimentary sequences, confirming that hydrological variability was a basin-wide phenomenon. Yet the degree of damage varied spatially, emphasizing localized experience rather than universal catastrophe. These patterns help explain why Mesopotamian narratives could integrate flood events as moral or cosmological symbols without strictly reflecting historical magnitude. Mythic expansion of environmental stress into theological storytelling served cultural and social functions, bridging observation with interpretation. Finally, the combination of archaeology, geomorphology, and paleo-environmental analysis underscores the complex interaction between humans and water. Settlements were strategically located to exploit fertile soils while mitigating flood risk, and infrastructure demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of seasonal rhythms, sediment deposition, and marshland management. Flood narratives, therefore, reflect not only natural hazards but also human ingenuity and adaptation, preserving both ecological memory and cultural values. Other regions offer equally compelling physical evidence. Some floods were so vast they reshaped entire continents. Ice dam outburst floods, or jokulhlops, represent one of the most dramatic hydrological phenomena of the late Pleistocene, capable of producing landscapes of unparalleled scale and power. Glacial lakes formed behind ice sheets, temporary reservoirs held in check by glacial ice or moraines, could release catastrophic discharges when the ice failed. Two of the most extensively studied events occurred at Glacial Lake Missoula in North America and Glacial Lake Agassiz in Central North America, each demonstrating the potential for sudden, enormous floodwaters to reshape topography, redistribute sediment, and influence both ecology and early human settlement patterns. Glacial Lake Missoula, located in western Montana, accumulated approximately 2,100 cubic kilometers of water behind an ice dam during the last glacial maximum. Evidence indicates that repeated failures of the ice barrier released immense torrents down the Clark Fork and Columbia River valleys between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. Geomorphologists have identified extensive scoured bedrock, gravel bars, and ripple marks extending hundreds of kilometers downstream, collectively forming the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. Sedimentological analysis confirms deposition patterns consistent with high-velocity, high-volume flow, with estimates of peak discharge reaching 17 million cubic meters per second, roughly 10 times the combined flow of all modern rivers globally. Each Jokulhlop persisted for days to weeks, delivering catastrophic energy capable of eroding bedrock and transporting massive boulders. Glacial Lake Agassiz, spanning parts of present-day Canada and the northern United States, produced similarly extraordinary events. At various points during the late Pleistocene, the lake's drainage was temporarily obstructed by ice or glacial debris. When these barriers failed, enormous outbursts inundated downstream regions along the Red River and the Great Lakes, ultimately impacting North Atlantic oceanography. Stratigraphic cores, VARV analysis, and sediment distribution studies suggest discharge volumes exceeding 9,000 cubic kilometers in some episodes. The resulting geomorphic effects included scoured river valleys, reworked glacial deposits, and transient proglacial lakes, demonstrating the capacity of these megafloods to alter continental-scale drainage networks. The formation of these floods reflects a combination of glacial, hydrological, and climatic factors. Ice sheets acted as both dams and reservoirs, with thermal dynamics, basal melting, and ice movement determining the stability of impounding barriers. Meltwater accumulation behind these barriers produced significant hydraulic pressure, which, upon structural failure, triggered rapid, high-energy release. Repeated cycles of accumulation and failure produce sequences of scouring, deposition, and floodplain modification that are preserved in the geological record. Radiocarbon dating, VARV chronology, and cosmogenic isotope analysis allow precise reconstruction of these events, confirming both their magnitude and episodic nature. These ice dam outbursts offer insight into the potential origins of flood memory and myth. While geographically removed from the earliest human-literate cultures, the sheer scale of these events demonstrates the type of hydrological phenomena capable of inspiring stories of cataclysmic inundation. Geological records show that the velocity, depth, and energy of megafloods were sufficient to erase settlements, reorganize drainage systems, and create features previously interpreted as supernatural or inexplicable. In regions where humans were contemporaneous with glacial meltwater processes, such events likely entered oral tradition, encoding environmental experience in the form of mythic narrative or warning. The channeled scablands provide a particularly vivid example. Repetitive scouring and deposition patterns indicate multiple, discrete floods over a period of approximately 2,000 years. Each Jokulhlop reshaped the landscape, leaving behind polished basalt, erratic boulders, and ephemeral slackwater deposits. Paleohydrological modeling suggests that floodwaters frequently reached velocities of 30 meters per second, sufficient to transport cobbles weighing tens of tons. These observations confirm that ice dam outburst floods were capable of reshaping regional topography, producing conditions analogous to the catastrophic scales described in some flood myths, albeit without invoking supernatural causation. Glacial Lake Agassiz further demonstrates the continental influence of these events. Evidence indicates that at least one major outburst temporarily affected global climate by altering thermohaline circulation in the North Atlantic. The sudden influx of fresh water disrupted ocean currents, potentially triggering the Younger Dryas cold event. Such a combination of environmental catastrophe and climatic impact underscores the profound influence of megafloods, linking local geomorphic transformation to broader Earth system processes. These connections provide a compelling framework for understanding how early societies might have interpreted extreme hydrological phenomena as divinely or cosmologically significant. Interpretively, ice dam outburst floods illustrate the range of natural forces capable of producing large-scale inundation independent of tectonic or volcanic activity. They demonstrate that floods need not be associated with a single catastrophic river event to achieve mythic proportions. Rather, repeated, high-magnitude discharges can produce cumulative landscape effects comparable to the narrative exaggerations found in human storytelling. Furthermore, sedimentological and geomorphic evidence allows precise reconstruction of the physical parameters of these floods, offering a benchmark against which comparative mythology can be measured. A second analytical observation concerns their episodic nature. Unlike continuous river flooding, ice dam outbursts were highly intermittent, with intervals of stability punctuated by catastrophic discharge. This variability may explain why oral traditions and mythic narratives often describe sudden, overwhelming floods rather than gradual environmental changes. The linkage of episodic catastrophic events to human experience, loss of land, destruction of resources, and disruption of settlement, would have created a durable narrative template, informing both ritualized responses and cultural memory. Finally, megafloods provide a geological analog for interpreting global flood narratives. While culturally specific floods such as those in Mesopotamia, China, or the Indian subcontinent reflect localized riverine or coastal events, ice dam outbursts illustrate the extreme upper bounds of hydrological power. Their study emphasizes that flood mythology can emerge from empirical experience with water at multiple scales, from seasonal river overflow to continental-scale outburst events, highlighting the dynamic interplay between environment, memory, and storytelling. Smaller but culturally significant floods occurred in Eurasia. Europe's coastlines shifted dramatically as ice sheets collapsed. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene saw extensive hydrological change across Eurasia, as retreating glaciers, rising sea levels, and riverine dynamics combined to produce catastrophic floods in multiple regions. Among the most studied are the Black Sea, Caspian Basin, and Danube Valley, where geomorphological evidence indicates sudden transgressions, outburst events, and extensive sediment redistribution. These events provide crucial context for understanding how early human populations experienced environmental upheaval and how such experiences may have been encoded in oral traditions and later mythologies. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, first proposed in the late 20th century, suggests that around 7,500 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Sill, rapidly flooding the previously isolated freshwater lake. Bathymetric mapping reveals submerged shorelines, drowned river valleys, and deltaic deposits consistent with a significant marine transgression. Sediment cores show abrupt changes in salinity, microfossil assemblages, and deposition rates, indicating a sudden influx of saltwater. While the timing and magnitude of this event remain debated, modern geochronology suggests a rapid flooding episode sufficient to inundate low-lying settlements and transform the Black Sea basin from a freshwater to a brackish environment. These physical data provide a compelling framework for understanding why the Black Sea region features persistent flood motifs in local and neighboring cultures. The Caspian Basin presents complementary evidence of large-scale inundation during the early Holocene. Archaeological surveys and sediment analysis indicate that fluctuating lake levels periodically submerge settlements along the Volga and Ural river systems. Radiocarbon-dated alluvial deposits show episodes of rapid water rise, sometimes exceeding several meters over a few decades. These events would have required human communities to relocate, adapt subsistence strategies, and develop flood management techniques, leaving both material and cultural traces. In some cases, folk narratives recount ancestral villages lost beneath water or warn of unpredictable river behavior, suggesting long-term memory of environmental hazard. The Danube Valley also illustrates the effects of glacial meltwater and post-glacial sea level rise on human settlements. Stratigraphic studies indicate multiple high-energy flood episodes during the early Holocene, particularly in low-lying plains and marshlands. Sedimentological evidence includes scoured channels, overbank silt layers, and buried occupation surfaces, demonstrating the capacity of riverine floods to destroy habitations, displace populations, and reshape floodplains. Paleoenvironmental reconstruction suggests that these floods coincided with regional climatic warming, glacial retreat, and increased precipitation, amplifying river discharge and creating the potential for repeated inundation cycles. Archaeological evidence confirms that Neolithic settlements were repeatedly affected, necessitating adaptation and sometimes relocation, contributing to the persistence of local flood narratives. Interdisciplinary analysis supports the significance of these events for human culture. Paleoecological data, combined with sedimentary studies, indicate that the floods were severe enough to influence settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and material culture, but not global in scale. The abruptness and magnitude of transgression events may have made a lasting impression on affected communities, providing the basis for oral transmission over generations. Linguistic and ethnographic studies suggest that such memories could be preserved in the form of cautionary tales, ritual practices, and origin myths, encoding environmental knowledge in socially and spiritually meaningful ways. The Black Sea flood hypothesis illustrates both the potential and limitations of correlating geological events with myth. While submerged shorelines and sediment cores indicate a rapid transgression, the precise rate and human impact remain debated. Estimates of water volume and influx velocity vary, and the archaeological record shows limited direct evidence of contemporaneous habitation loss. Nevertheless, the convergence of geomorphic, hydrological, and paleoecological data supports the plausibility of substantial flooding, providing a scientifically grounded explanation for the widespread persistence of flood motifs in southeastern Europe and Anatolia. Comparative analysis reveals a consistent pattern. Large-scale hydrological events in Eurasia were episodic, regionally variable, and capable of reshaping both the physical landscape and human cultural practice. The Black Sea, Caspian, and Danube regions all exhibit evidence of sudden inundation, rapid sediment deposition, and landscape transformation. In each case, human communities demonstrated adaptive responses, from relocating settlements to modifying subsistence and water management strategies. These responses, in turn, likely informed narrative memory, reinforcing the perception of water as both a destructive and formative force. Interpretively, these floods demonstrate the role of cumulative environmental stress in shaping human culture. Unlike singular, mythologized deluges, the Eurasian record reflects a series of localized yet impactful events that could have been transmitted through oral tradition, later codified in story form. The convergence of environmental observation, survival necessity, and cultural encoding highlights the mechanisms by which catastrophic phenomena are remembered and mythologized. Regional differences in flood magnitude, seasonality, and geomorphology produce narratives tailored to specific human experiences, emphasizing both the universality and specificity of flood memory. Finally, these findings underscore the value of multidisciplinary research. Sedimentology, geomorphology, paleoecology, and archaeology together provide a nuanced understanding of Eurasian flood events, grounding cultural narratives in empirical evidence while avoiding speculative exaggeration. The integration of these fields allows scholars to reconstruct both the physical reality of flooding and the potential pathways by which it entered human consciousness, providing a scientifically rigorous context for the study of mythogenesis and environmental history. The next question is how these events preserved cultural memory. Flood stories endure because the events they describe were unforgettable. Anthropologists and cognitive archaeologists have long recognized that certain environmental events leave disproportionately strong impressions on human communities. Sudden, high-magnitude floods, whether riverine, coastal, or glacial in origin, represent both existential threats and profound disruptions to daily life. Their visibility, scale, and immediate consequences create experiences that are easily encoded in memory and transmitted across generations. In pre-literate societies, oral storytelling functions as both a mnemonic device and a vehicle for social cohesion, preserving critical environmental knowledge while embedding it within narrative frameworks. Cultural memory theory provides a framework for understanding how real floods could evolve into enduring narrative traditions. According to this perspective, communities retain knowledge of significant events not only through direct observation but also through ritualized retellings, symbolic representation, and social reinforcement. A catastrophic river flood, for example, would necessitate collective response, relocation, and reconstruction. The memory of such an event would be rehearsed and reinforced through stories, ceremonial observances, and taboos, creating durable patterns of transmission. Over successive generations, these memories could acquire symbolic and moral dimensions, encoding both practical lessons and cultural values. Oral transmission, by its nature, introduces adaptation, exaggeration, and selective emphasis. Cognitive research suggests that narratives emphasizing extreme outcomes, destruction, survival, and divine or natural causation are more likely to be retained and accurately transmitted than mundane events. Floods, by their dramatic and catastrophic nature, fit this criterion. As early human populations migrated or interacted with neighboring communities, these narratives could spread and integrate with local environmental experiences. The result is both continuity and variation. The underlying memory of high-magnitude inundation persists, even as details, location, and theological interpretation shift to accommodate new cultural contexts. Migration played a significant role in the dissemination of flood narratives. Archaeological evidence shows that during the Holocene, human groups expanded into previously uninhabited regions, crossing river valleys, coastal plains, and continental shelves newly exposed by glacial retreat. Such movements brought communities into contact with different hydrological regimes and flood-prone landscapes. These encounters could reinforce pre-existing flood memories or generate new narrative material. Linguistic and ethnographic studies indicate that many flood motifs exhibit remarkable stability across wide geographic regions, suggesting that oral transmission across migrating populations maintains structural continuity while allowing localized adaptation. The interaction between migration and environmental experience also highlights the role of cognitive scaffolding in flood memory. Story frameworks, repeated ritual motifs, and symbolic markers, such as archetypal boats, saving figures, or divine intermediaries, create durable cognitive templates. These templates facilitate transmission, enabling communities to retain and convey knowledge of events occurring centuries or millennia earlier. By integrating environmental observation with mnemonic and narrative structures, early societies transformed episodic catastrophe into culturally encoded memory, ensuring both survival knowledge and social cohesion. Comparative analysis of Eurasian, Mesopotamian, and other Holocene flood narratives illustrates the effectiveness of this transmission process. Regional flood events, whether documented archaeologically or reconstructed through paleohydrology, correspond to narrative features such as survival of a select family or lineage, the preservation of animals, and post-event ethical or ritual codification. These recurring elements suggest that oral traditions systematically encoded critical aspects of flood experience: timing, magnitude, human response, and moral or cosmological interpretation. The selective emphasis on these features reflects the intersection of practical necessity and cognitive preference, prioritizing information essential for community continuity and environmental adaptation. Archaeological evidence supports the plausibility of long-term transmission. Settlement patterns indicate repeated relocation and rebuilding in flood-prone zones, while stratigraphic sequences reveal episodic inundation events that align with the temporal scale necessary for intergenerational memory. In combination with paleoecological data, these findings provide a framework for understanding how repeated, high-impact environmental stress could generate durable narrative traditions. Oral transmission, reinforced by social practice and ritual, converted episodic reality into structured story forms capable of spanning centuries. A second analytical observation concerns the convergence of environmental and symbolic memory. Flood narratives often incorporate elements not strictly present in the physical event, such as divine or supernatural agency, moral causality, and prescriptive behavior. These elements do not undermine the empirical foundation of the story, but rather reflect the process by which humans interpret and encode extreme environmental events. The cognitive requirement to explain, assign causality, and guide behavior transforms episodic hydrological phenomena into enduring cultural constructs, linking material experience with symbolic representation. Finally, this framework provides insight into the persistence of flood narratives across regions and time. The Holocene was marked by continued sea level rise, river avulsions, and localized inundations, creating a background of recurring hydrological challenge. As human societies evolved, adopting agriculture, urbanization, and complex social organization, the memory of these floods remained salient. Stories of divine intervention, survival, and renewal functioned as both historical record and moral guide, reinforcing collective identity and environmental awareness. Oral traditions preserved the continuity of memory, bridging the gap between empirical experience and mythic representation. As the Holocene progressed, societies evolved, but flood memories remained. States emerged in part to control water, and in doing so, they diminished its destructive power. Across the ancient world, societies located along major rivers faced recurrent flooding that shaped both settlement patterns and political structures. Over time, the repeated threat of inundation incentivized the development of hydraulic engineering, transforming rivers from capricious agents of destruction into managed resources for agriculture, trade, and urban expansion. In Egypt, China, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, the construction of canals, levees, dikes, and reservoir systems represented deliberate technological interventions aimed at mitigating flood risk, stabilizing subsistence, and consolidating state authority. In Egypt, the annual inundation of the Nile was predictable but not without potential for localized devastation. From the Old Kingdom onward, communities implemented a combination of earthen embankments, diversion channels, and basin irrigation to regulate water flow and optimize agricultural yield. Archaeological surveys indicate that by the Third Dynasty, circa 2650 to 2575 BCE, large-scale canal networks connected flood basins to arable lands, distributing water across multiple settlements. Administrative records, including the Palermo stone and tomb inscriptions, detail labor organization for canal maintenance, reflecting both the technical complexity and bureaucratic coordination required to sustain hydraulic stability. By controlling the Nile, Egyptian states reduced vulnerability to extreme flooding, enabling urban consolidation and predictable food production. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates presented a more volatile challenge due to high sediment loads, channel shifting, and overbank flooding. Early city-states such as Uruk and Ur adapted through levee construction, canal networks, and coordinated drainage systems. Excavations reveal layered embankments and artificial river diversions, indicating multi-generational management of hydraulic infrastructure. Textual sources, including administrative tablets from the UR3 period, circa 2100 to 2000 BCE, document state-directed labor for canal upkeep and flood mitigation. These interventions allowed for intensification of agriculture, expansion of urban centers, and stabilization of political hierarchies, reducing reliance on religious explanations for flood events and emphasizing human agency in environmental control. The Indus Valley civilization demonstrates a parallel trajectory. Settlements such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were situated on natural terraces above floodplains, complemented by systematically planned drainage and water storage facilities. Archaeological surveys reveal well-engineered street-level drains, covered conduits, and reservoirs capable of managing seasonal monsoon-related flooding. Stratigraphic evidence indicates that these measures effectively protected urban cores from catastrophic inundation, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of local hydrology. By integrating flood management into urban planning, Indus authorities mitigated risk, supported population density, and facilitated centralized administration. China offers another instructive example. Along the Yellow River, early dynastic communities contended with highly unpredictable and destructive floods, sometimes referred to as the sorrow of the river. From the Xia period, circa 2070 to 1600 BCE, onward, Large-scale hydraulic projects, including levees, dikes, canals, and river diversions, were initiated to control both the course and intensity of the river. Textual sources such as the Bamboo Annals and later historical chronicles attribute these achievements to legendary figures like Yu the Great, emphasizing the integration of hydraulic skill with political legitimacy. Archaeological surveys corroborate these accounts, revealing engineered terraces, sediment stabilization structures, and evidence of planned floodplain management. These projects reduced vulnerability to catastrophic events while reinforcing centralized authority and the state's capacity to shape environmental outcomes. Collectively, these interventions highlight a consistent pattern. As societies developed bureaucratic and technical capacity, the magnitude and frequency of destructive flooding decreased. Hydraulic engineering transformed rivers from existential threats into manageable resources, allowing states to maintain agricultural productivity, support dense populations, and extend political control. Importantly, this technological adaptation influenced cultural perception. Rivers continued to provide water and fertility, but the sense of uncontrollable catastrophe diminished. In regions where floods had once inspired mythic and religious narratives, engineering achievements reframed the human relationship with water from passive vulnerability to active management. Interpretively, the emergence of state-directed hydraulic systems demonstrates the interplay between environmental pressure, technological innovation, and social organization. Floods that once threatened to obliterate settlements became catalysts for institutional development, promoting centralized authority, coordinated labor, and long-term planning. Archaeological evidence, including canal layouts, embankment construction techniques, and associated administrative records, shows that flood management was both a technological and political enterprise, reinforcing the symbiotic relationship between environmental adaptation and state formation. A second analytical insight concerns knowledge transmission. Hydraulic expertise required both empirical observation and cumulative learning across generations. Maintenance of levees, recalibration of canals, and sediment management relied on recorded experience, trial-and-error engineering, and coordinated labor. By stabilizing rivers through these measures, societies not only reduced physical risk but also codified technical knowledge into administrative and practical frameworks, allowing subsequent generations to inherit both infrastructure and institutional capacity. This continuity contrasts sharply with earlier periods, when floods were unpredictable, catastrophic, and primarily encoded through oral or mythic memory. Finally, hydraulic control influenced cultural narratives. As states mitigated flood risk, the original dramatic threat of inundation receded, and mythic interpretations of floods evolved accordingly. Stories that once emphasized divine punishment or cosmic cataclysm shifted toward symbolic, moral, or historical functions. In Egypt, for example, the predictable Nile inundation became a marker of seasonal order rather than a site of existential anxiety. In China, the accomplishments of Yu the Great reframed the flood from an uncontrollable natural event to a demonstration of human ingenuity and state authority. Across Mesopotamia and the Indus, narratives about ancestral floods persisted but were increasingly contextualized within technological, political, or cultural frameworks. With engineered stability came new interpretations of older myths. As societies changed, the flood became metaphor rather than memory. By the classical period, major civilizations had largely stabilized hydrological systems and institutionalized urban life, reducing the direct experiential impact of catastrophic flooding. Consequently, flood narratives were increasingly reinterpreted as symbolic, moral, or cosmological lessons rather than literal accounts of environmental disaster. In Greece, for example, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha reflects this transition. According to sources such as Hesiod's Works and Days and later historians like Apollodorus, the flood served as divine retribution for human impiety, with survival contingent upon piety and obedience rather than engineering or local adaptation. The narrative emphasizes continuity of civilization through human agency and moral order, illustrating how early environmental memory was transformed into a didactic motif. Roman literature similarly adapted flood narratives to serve civic, moral, and historiographical purposes. Authors such as Ovid in the Metamorphoses recount the Deucalion flood with attention to human renewal and societal regeneration, framing the event as a reset of civilization rather than an empirically grounded hydrological occurrence. Roman reinterpretation also integrated Greek myth into local cosmology, demonstrating the intertextual and cultural transmission of flood motifs across Mediterranean societies. The narrative reflects an emerging conceptual separation between empirical experience and literary or symbolic representation, as well as the consolidation of human history into interpretive frameworks shaped by morality, order, and divine authority. During the medieval Christian period, the flood narrative became central to theological and exegetically discourse. The biblical story of Noah, as codified in Genesis, was transmitted and elaborated through commentaries, hagiographies, and liturgical texts. Church fathers such as Augustine and later scholastics interpreted the flood as both historical and allegorical, emphasizing divine justice, moral instruction, and typology. Illustrations in manuscripts and ecclesiastical art often focused on Noah's obedience and the survival of a righteous remnant, rather than the physical mechanics of inundation. These interpretations reflect the broader medieval tendency to integrate natural events within a providential worldview, where catastrophic flooding was a vehicle for teaching, spiritual reflection, and the reinforcement of social norms. Islamic historiography similarly incorporated the flood into broader cosmological and moral frameworks. The Quranic account of Noah emphasizes prophetic warning, divine judgment, and human accountability. Commentators elaborated on flood narratives to illustrate theological principles, often drawing analogues with prior Semitic traditions, including Mesopotamian antecedents. While geographical and hydrological detail is limited, the narrative retains key structural elements, destruction, survival, and covenantal renewal, demonstrating continuity with earlier mythic motifs, while adapting them to religious and ethical paradigms specific to the Islamic intellectual milieu. Analytically, these transformations reveal how societal stabilization and institutional development reshaped flood memory. With reduced exposure to catastrophic flooding, communities no longer required literal accounts to preserve survival knowledge. The narrative function shifted toward instruction, allegory, and symbolic representation. The endurance of flood motifs, despite diminished empirical relevance, reflects the cognitive tendency to preserve dramatic and socially salient events through narrative abstraction. Floods persisted as cultural memory not because of direct observation but because of their capacity to convey moral, political, and theological lessons. A second observation concerns cross-cultural synthesis. Classical and medieval authors frequently adapted pre-existing flood narratives to local social, moral, or religious contexts, creating a palimpsest of tradition. Greek Deucalion, Roman retellings, Christian Noah, and Islamic Na all share structural continuity, catastrophic inundation, human survival, and post-flood renewal, while varying in causal explanation, theological framing, and cultural emphasis. These adaptations demonstrate both the resilience and malleability of flood narratives, highlighting how myth evolves in response to changing environmental, social, and cognitive conditions. Finally, the transformation of flood stories during these eras underscores the broader relationship between experience and cultural codification. Early floods were encoded in oral tradition and localized myth, reflecting empirical environmental challenges. With the advent of literate, state-level societies, flood narratives became repositories of ethical, cosmological, and historiographical knowledge. Textualization allowed for standardization, preservation across time and space, and integration into broader intellectual frameworks. Floods were no longer primarily remembered as immediate natural disasters, but as enduring symbols of moral order, human resilience, and divine authority. This historiographical evolution illustrates the cumulative process by which empirical experience becomes cultural artifact, transmitted across centuries and adapted to diverse social and religious frameworks. By the end of the medieval period, floods functioned primarily as conceptual and moral touchstones, marking continuity with ancestral narratives while reflecting contemporary societal priorities. This brings us to the final question: what remains of the flood in modern thought? The modern study of floods combines geology, anthropology, and textual analysis. Contemporary scholarship approaches flood narratives not as literal accounts of a single global catastrophe, but as complex intersections of environmental events, human perception, and cultural memory. Archaeology, paleohydrology, and comparative mythology collectively provide a framework for evaluating both the empirical and symbolic dimensions of deluge traditions. Researchers examine sedimentary sequences, radiocarbon-dated flood layers, and geomorphological features to reconstruct the scale, frequency, and regional impact of Holocene inundations, while anthropologists and philologists study the transmission, adaptation, and persistence of flood narratives across human societies. Archaeological studies offer concrete evidence for episodic flooding that may underlie some mythic accounts. Excavations at sites across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, and southeastern Europe reveal stratigraphic sequences containing alluvial deposits, scoured surfaces, and buried occupation layers. Radiocarbon dating indicates these events were temporally localized, often affecting single generations or clusters of settlements rather than entire continents. While some catastrophic floods were regionally transformative, no archaeological record supports a simultaneous global deluge. These findings emphasize that many ancient flood narratives likely reflect cumulative local experiences encoded over multiple generations, rather than first-hand observation of a singular universal event. Paleohydrology contributes additional resolution by analyzing riverine dynamics, glacial meltwater pulses, and Holocene sea level rise. Studies of the Tigris, Euphrates, Yellow, Nile, and Danube systems demonstrate episodic flooding capable of reshaping landscapes and displacing populations. Similarly, geological investigation of Black Sea and Sundaland transgressions provides insight into abrupt inundation events in coastal regions. By quantifying water volumes, sediment loads, and inundation extents, paleohydrologists offer empirical parameters for evaluating the plausibility of associated flood traditions. These analyses establish a clear distinction between local, high-impact hydrological events and the narrative embellishment found in mythic retellings. Comparative mythology and philology reveal structural continuity across flood narratives while highlighting regional specificity. Motifs such as survival of a chosen individual or family, the preservation of animals, and post-flood renewal recur in Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Indian, Chinese, Biblical, and Pacific Islander traditions. Variations in cosmology, theology, and socio-political framing demonstrate that while flood narratives share a cognitive template, they are adapted to local circumstances, belief systems, and social norms. Interdisciplinary scholarship shows that these stories encode practical knowledge, warning of environmental hazards, reinforcing social cohesion, and legitimizing leadership, alongside symbolic and moral meaning. Modern debate also addresses the tension between literal and interpretive readings of flood accounts. Popular notions of a global flood have been largely rejected in scientific discourse, as geological evidence does not support synchronous, worldwide inundation within the timeframe suggested by ancient texts. Instead, researchers emphasize regional megafloods, episodic river avulsions, and sea level rise as plausible catalysts for narrative formation. Critical scholarship thus frames flood myths as culturally mediated responses to environmental stress rather than eyewitness chronicles of global catastrophe. This distinction underscores the importance of integrating multiple disciplinary perspectives when evaluating historical narratives. A further insight emerges from cognitive archaeology, which considers the mechanisms of long-term memory and oral transmission. High-impact events like floods are preferentially encoded, rehearsed, and transmitted through ritualized storytelling, creating durable cultural templates. Over centuries, these templates may incorporate moral, cosmological, and political dimensions, producing narratives that simultaneously preserve environmental memory and articulate societal values. Flood narratives, therefore, exemplify the interplay between material conditions and symbolic cognition, bridging empirical events and human interpretation. Finally, the synthesis of archaeology, hydrology, and myth studies illustrates both the universality and specificity of flood traditions. Catastrophic water events are a recurrent feature of human experience, shaping settlement strategies, technological adaptation, and social organization. Narrative forms, whether encoded in tablets, scriptures, or oral recitations, provide a mechanism for retaining and transmitting this knowledge across generations. By combining empirical reconstruction with textual and anthropological analysis, modern scholarship offers a nuanced understanding of how the Great Flood operates simultaneously as historical phenomenon, cultural artifact, and enduring symbol. These threads converge in assessing the Great Flood's historical legacy. The flood endures because it reflects a universal human fear and experience. Across continents and millennia, societies have repeatedly confronted the dual power of water, as a source of life and as a potential agent of destruction. Human settlements have historically clustered near rivers, lakes, and coastlines, attracted by fertile soils, freshwater availability, and transportation opportunities. This settlement pattern, however, exposed communities to episodic inundation, storm surges, and sea level rise. The repeated threat of environmental catastrophe, coupled with the necessity of communal response and adaptive strategies, created conditions in which flood events were both cognitively salient and socially significant, facilitating their codification into narrative and myth. Anthropological studies indicate that catastrophic environmental events are more likely to be encoded into long-term cultural memory when they disrupt subsistence, force collective action, or threaten survival. Floods, by virtue of their scale and unpredictability, meet all these criteria. Across different ecological and cultural contexts, humans respond to water disasters by developing early warning practices, constructing temporary or permanent protective infrastructure, and transmitting knowledge through ritualized storytelling. Oral traditions, in particular, preserve the memory of these events with remarkable fidelity, often incorporating moral, cosmological, or social lessons alongside empirical observations. Such narratives provide both a cautionary function and a mechanism for reinforcing communal cohesion in the face of environmental risk. Geographical factors also contribute to the ubiquity of flood narratives. Regions with high riverine density, extensive floodplains, or low-lying coastal zones experience recurrent inundation. This environmental pressure produces similar human responses, relocation, adaptation, and cultural encoding, across otherwise disconnected societies. Archaeological and geomorphological studies corroborate the prevalence of flood episodes in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Even in areas where catastrophic flooding was rare, memory of extraordinary events could be amplified through storytelling, ritual commemoration, and integration into broader cosmological frameworks. The universality of these motifs reflects convergent cultural evolution, wherein distinct societies independently encode salient environmental experiences into narrative form. Cognitive factors further reinforce the prevalence of flood narratives. Humans exhibit a heightened capacity to remember and transmit high-impact, emotionally and physically salient events. Floods, which combine immediate threat with dramatic spatial transformation, naturally attract attention and facilitate retention in collective memory. Key narrative elements: survival of a select individual or group, preservation of animals, post-disaster renewal, recursively appear in independent cultural contexts, suggesting that cognitive and mnemonic structures shape both the content and persistence of flood myths. Such motifs are not arbitrary. They reflect a structured response to universally recognizable environmental pressures. Comparative analysis of global flood traditions reveals both continuity and variability. While the structural components of deluge narratives, catastrophe, survival, and renewal, are remarkably consistent, local geography, hydrology, and cultural priorities produce regionally distinct expressions. In Mesopotamia, floods are often framed as divine judgment in response to human activity, reflecting theological interpretation superimposed on environmental memory. In China, flood control and hydraulic ingenuity are central, with narratives emphasizing human mastery over natural forces. In the Americas, Polynesia, and Australia, coastal inundation or riverine overflow is encoded in oral traditions with explicit references to submerged landscapes or migratory displacement. These variations illustrate the interplay of environment, cognition, and cultural framing in shaping flood mythology. Settlement bias toward rivers also reinforces the salience of flood narratives in material and textual records. Archaeologically, riverine sites preserve both evidence of human adaptation and sedimentary indicators of flooding, creating a feedback loop between environmental experience and material culture. Urban centers along major waterways often contain multiple layers of alluvial deposits, reflecting recurrent inundation and influencing the development of architecture, urban planning, and state organization. These physical traces, in turn, anchor flood memory in observable reality, enabling both empirical documentation and narrative elaboration. Finally, the flood as a universal human theme serves a dual function. It encodes environmental experience and provides a framework for moral, cosmological, or social reflection. Across cultures, floods symbolize both vulnerability and resilience, destruction and renewal. By examining these narratives in aggregate, scholars can identify the underlying cognitive, environmental, and social drivers that contribute to their ubiquity. Flood myths are not merely literary artifacts. They are records of human-environment interaction, encoded in forms that resonate across time and geography. Science offers its own interpretation. The evidence shows many great floods, but not one world-ending event. Modern geology, paleohydrology, and archaeology collectively demonstrate that while large-scale regional floods occurred throughout human history, no single global deluge corresponds to the flood narratives found across cultures. Stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and geomorphological surveys consistently indicate that major inundations were episodic, regionally contained, and temporally localized, rather than simultaneous and universal. These findings reconcile empirical observation with the persistence of flood myths. Catastrophic events left durable impressions on communities, which were then transmitted, adapted, and codified over generations. In Mesopotamia, for example, early dynastic and UR3 flood layers document substantial overbanking of the Tigris and Euphrates around 2900 to 2000 BCE. Archaeological excavations reveal thick alluvial deposits at sites such as Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, indicating localized inundation capable of displacing populations and destroying settlements. Similar episodes are recorded in the Indus Valley, where Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa exhibit sedimentary evidence of seasonal monsoon flooding and occasional high-magnitude events between 2600 and 1900 BCE. In China, Yellow River flood deposits and Paleolake outburst evidence from Qinghai and the middle-lower reaches of the river confirm episodic inundations that likely inspired narratives of Yu the Great. Collectively, these regional events provide concrete, datable instances of environmental catastrophe that could give rise to enduring flood memory. Coastal regions experienced comparable inundations during the Holocene. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis, although debated, suggests that rapid sea level rise and potential breach of freshwater lakes into the rising Mediterranean basin around 5600 BCE inundated substantial low-lying areas. Sundaland, the Persian Gulf Basin, and parts of Southeast Asia underwent progressive submergence due to post-glacial sea level rise, reshaping coastlines and isolating communities. Archaeological sites such as at Lityam in the eastern Mediterranean and submerged settlements in Indonesia and Malaysia provide tangible evidence of human displacement or adaptation in response to rising waters. These regional inundations, while profound locally, do not support the notion of a global, simultaneous flood. Glacial and post-glacial processes also contributed to episodic megafloods with continental-scale impact, though still geographically restricted. Outburst floods from glacial Lake Missoula in North America and Lake Agassiz in Canada sculpted massive channels and reshaped topography, creating dramatic landscapes like the channeled Scablands. While visually impressive and geomorphologically transformative, these events were regional in scope and temporally brief, illustrating the capacity for nature to generate extreme inundation without producing a worldwide deluge. The persistence of flood narratives, despite these geographic limitations, can be explained through the lens of cultural memory. Communities repeatedly exposed to floods, even at local or regional scales, developed mnemonic frameworks and oral traditions that emphasize the dramatic and existential aspects of inundation. Over generations, these stories could merge, transform, or adapt, resulting in culturally widespread motifs of divine punishment, survival of a chosen few, and environmental renewal. Comparative mythology reveals structural similarities, catastrophe, preservation, and post-event reconstruction. Across Mesopotamia, India, China, the Mediterranean, Oceania, and the Americas, despite the absence of a single shared event. This convergence reflects cognitive salience and narrative utility rather than literal simultaneity. Scientific study further clarifies the relationship between empirical flood events and global myth-making. Hydrological modeling, sediment analysis, and radiocarbon dating allow researchers to establish the frequency, magnitude, and spatial extent of individual floods. Combined with archaeological evidence of settlement abandonment, canal construction, and urban adaptation, these data show that floods had profound local impacts, sufficient to generate stories that persisted for millennia. However, the global coherence of the flood motif arises from convergent cultural evolution. Societies experiencing similar environmental pressures independently encoded extreme water events into narrative frameworks, rather than inheriting a single shared historical incident. Finally, distinguishing geological reality from myth emphasizes both the power and flexibility of human storytelling. Flood narratives integrate empirical experience, social memory, and moral or cosmological interpretation. The universality of the motif does not require literal global correspondence. Instead, it reflects the repeated interface between humans and water, the cognitive prioritization of high-impact events, and the social necessity of transmitting adaptive knowledge. By understanding the scale and context of real inundations, scholars reconcile the rich diversity of flood myths with observable evidence, demonstrating that cultural memory preserves the essence of environmental experience without requiring exact replication of events. What, then, does the Great Flood mean today? The Great Flood remains one of humanity's oldest and most persistent stories. Across time and geography, flood narratives have served as a bridge between lived experience, environmental observation, and cultural expression. In the modern era, the study of these stories unites multiple disciplines: archaeology, geology, anthropology, comparative mythology, and textual criticism, revealing how ancient societies perceived and responded to water's power. Simultaneously, floods continue to shape cultural identity, appearing in religious discourse, literature, art, and popular imagination. This enduring presence demonstrates the capacity of a single motif to carry empirical, moral, and symbolic meaning across millennia. Academic inquiry situates flood narratives within concrete environmental and historical contexts. Archaeologists examine sedimentary layers, alluvial deposits, and submerged settlements to reconstruct the scale and impact of specific inundations. Paleohydrologists quantify river discharge, glacial meltwater pulses, and Holocene sea level rise to determine which events plausibly influenced human societies. Comparative mythologists and philologists trace narrative structures, motifs, and transmission patterns, identifying shared cognitive templates and cultural adaptations. By integrating these approaches, modern scholarship distinguishes between episodic regional floods and the mythic abstraction of a universal deluge, clarifying the interplay between human experience and narrative representation. Cultural studies further illuminate how flood narratives continue to resonate. In religious contexts, the story of Noah, the Chinese Great Flood, Manu in India, and Yima in Iran all provide frameworks for moral instruction, communal identity, and the justification of social or political order. Floods are used allegorically to discuss divine justice, human responsibility, environmental stewardship, and renewal. Even outside religious frameworks, these narratives appear in literature, visual art, and film, demonstrating their symbolic versatility. The Great Flood functions as a narrative touchstone, connecting contemporary audiences with the historical and cognitive experiences of past societies. From a historiographical perspective, flood narratives exemplify the persistence and evolution of collective memory. Stories originating in localized, empirically grounded events became codified, adapted, and transmitted through oral and written forms, enduring across centuries. Modern scholarship reveals how these transformations reflect shifts in technology, governance, and environmental management. For example, once societies developed effective hydraulic engineering, the existential threat posed by flooding diminished, and myths increasingly emphasized moral, cosmological, or political lessons rather than literal danger. This continuity of narrative, despite changing material circumstances, illustrates the interplay between environmental experience and cultural imagination. At the intersection of myth and science, floods provide a model for understanding how humans encode, preserve, and interpret high-impact events. Flood narratives demonstrate cognitive salience. Extreme natural events are preferentially remembered, rehearsed, and transmitted. They also illustrate adaptive social function. Narratives guide behavior, consolidate collective memory, and reinforce communal norms. Modern interdisciplinary research, combining environmental science and cultural analysis, validates the empirical basis of many narratives while clarifying their symbolic and instructive dimensions. Thus, the Great Flood remains simultaneously an object of empirical study and a vessel for cultural continuity. The continued fascination with floods in popular imagination underscores their universality. Documentaries, novels, films, and visual media repeatedly return to the theme of inundation, survival, and renewal. These contemporary interpretations echo structural elements found in ancient narratives: selective preservation of life, human ingenuity or divine intervention, and post-event reconstruction. The motif persists not because of historical accuracy alone, but because it addresses fundamental human concerns: mortality, vulnerability, resilience, and the relationship between humans and the environment. The symbolic potency of floods ensures their relevance across time, connecting modern audiences with ancestral cognitive and cultural frameworks. Finally, the Great Flood exemplifies the integration of scientific, cultural, and historical understanding. By synthesizing geological evidence, archaeological records, and textual traditions, scholars provide a nuanced appreciation of both the reality and the enduring significance of flood events. Flood narratives remind us that human societies have long been shaped by environmental forces and have responded with ingenuity, observation, and storytelling. The legacy of the flood is thus both empirical and symbolic. It records the challenges posed by water, the technological and social adaptations developed in response, and the enduring capacity of narrative to transmit meaning across generations. As the documentary concludes, the Great Flood stands as a testament to the enduring dialogue between humanity and water, between observation and interpretation, between disaster and cultural memory. Its legacy persists in science, religion, literature, and collective imagination, illustrating how a single motif can encapsulate both the material realities and the enduring narratives of human experience. If you found this exploration of the Great Flood enlightening, consider subscribing for more in-depth, research-driven documentaries on the civilizations, myths, and historical events that shaped our world. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments. We welcome discussion grounded in evidence and scholarship. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on future episodes that connect archaeology, history, and cultural memory in a calm, informative, and cinematic way.